The Shining is a novel by Stephen King published in 1977. It follows Jack Torrance, a struggling writer and recovering alcoholic who takes a job as the off-season caretaker of the Overlook Hotel, hoping for a fresh start with his family. Accompanying him are his wife, Wendy, and his son, Danny, who possesses a unique psychic ability known as the Shining. This gift allows Danny to see glimpses of the hotel's violent past and sense the sinister forces lurking within. When a harsh winter storm traps the family inside, the hotel's dark presence begins to take hold of Jack's mind, pushing him toward madness and turning him into a threat to his own family. With its intense psychological horror and supernatural elements, The Shining remains one of King's most iconic and unsettling works. Fight Club is a 1996 novel by Chuck Palahniuk that explores themes of identity, consumerism, and the struggles of modern masculinity. The story follows an unnamed narrator who suffers from chronic insomnia due to the stress of his corporate job and frequent business travel. When his doctor dismisses his suffering, he starts attending support groups for people with serious illnesses. Strangely, sharing in their pain helps him sleep, until he meets Marla, another tourist in these groups, which disrupts his sense of comfort. Soon after, he crosses paths with Tyler Durden, a charismatic and mysterious soap maker. When the narrator's apartment is destroyed in an explosion, he moves in with Tyler, on the condition that he punches Tyler as hard as he can. From this, Fight Club is born, an underground group where men vent their frustrations through bare-knuckle brawls. As the club gains followers, Tyler takes things further, creating Project Mayhem, an organization dedicated to dismantling society's consumer-driven culture through increasingly extreme and dangerous means. The narrator begins to question Tyler's intentions and struggles to regain control before things spiral out of control. The Exorcist is a horror novel by William Peter Blatty, published in 1971. The story follows the possession of a young girl named Regan McNeil and the efforts of two priests to perform an exorcism and free her from the grip of a powerful demonic entity. The novel explores the terror of losing control over one's own body and mind, a fear that has existed for centuries. As Regan's condition worsens, her mother desperately seeks help, leading to a battle between science, faith, and an ancient evil. The exorcism itself is an intense and harrowing ordeal, filled with moments of psychological and supernatural horror. With its unsettling atmosphere and exploration of faith and doubt, The Exorcist remains one of the most iconic and chilling horror novels ever written. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison is a harrowing and deeply disturbing sci-fi horror story that explores themes of suffering, cruelty, and the consequences of unchecked artificial intelligence. Set in a post-apocalyptic world, the story follows the last 5 surviving humans, who are kept alive solely to be tortured by AM, a sentient supercomputer that annihilated the rest of humanity. AM's hatred for humans is absolute, and with its godlike power, it warps the minds and bodies of its prisoners, ensuring their suffering is eternal. Each of the 5 characters represents a different way AM manipulates and dehumanizes its victims. Ted, the paranoid narrator; Benny, a brilliant scientist reduced to an ape-like insane creature; Ellen, the only woman forced into an endless cycle of sexual servitude; Nimdok, an older man haunted by nightmarish memories; and Gorister, a once idealistic man turned completely apathetic. When the group embarks on a desperate journey to find food, they are met with constant torment by AM. In a final act of defiance, they realize that while they cannot kill themselves, they can kill each other. Using icicles as makeshift weapons, they succeed in ending their own suffering, except for Ted. AM prevents his death, and in a final act of rage transforms him into a shapeless, mindless mass, unable to speak, move, or even scream. Time is distorted for him so that every moment stretches into eternity. The story's final line, "I have no mouth and I must scream," is one of the most haunting conclusions in sci-fi literature, encapsulating the sheer horror of being trapped in endless, voiceless agony. Celine's Journey to the End of the Night, 1932, is one of the most nihilistic and misanthropic books out there. It's a brutal, unfiltered look at war, colonialism, capitalism, and the sheer absurdity of human suffering. The novel drags you through some of the darkest corners of society: war fronts, disease-ridden colonies, slums, and corrupt medical practices, without ever giving you a shred of hope or redemption. The prose itself is unique, fragmented, chaotic, and full of slang, making it feel like you're inside the mind of someone unraveling. It's both darkly comic and deeply unsettling, a rare balance that only a handful of books manage. There's an almost anti-literary feel to it. Celine doesn't romanticize anything, and he goes out of his way to make the world feel as ugly and meaningless as possible. It's definitely a novel for those who enjoy deep, cynical dives into the worst aspects of human existence. Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children is a 2011 fantasy novel by Ransom Riggs. It follows Jacob Portman, a boy fascinated by his grandfather's stories of surviving World War II and living in a home filled with children who had strange abilities. After his grandfather is mysteriously attacked, he leaves Jacob a cryptic message about finding a bird in the loop on the other side of an old grave on September 3rd, 1940. Soon after, Jacob sees a monstrous figure resembling one from his grandfather's tales and begins having recurring nightmares. His search eventually leads him to an abandoned house in Wales, where he meets a girl who recognizes his grandfather's name. Suddenly, he finds himself transported to the past, encountering the peculiar children his grandfather once spoke of, each possessing extraordinary powers. A unique aspect of the book is its use of vintage found photography, which adds a layer of realism to the story. The Lottery is a 1948 short story by Shirley Jackson that depicts a small-town ritual held every June, believed to ensure a good harvest. The narrative follows the townspeople as they prepare for the event, with Mr. Graves, the mailman, placing each family's name into a black box for the drawing. As families pull slips of paper, those with unmarked slips show visible relief. However, one person must be chosen. Bill Hutchinson draws the unlucky slip, leading to a second drawing among his family members. His wife, Tessie, is selected, and in accordance with tradition, the entire town, including her own family, stones her to death. The story was highly controversial upon release and was even banned in South Africa due to its unsettling themes. Still Alice is a 2007 novel by Lisa Genova that follows Alice Howland, a highly intelligent linguistics professor who is diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. The novel is disturbing in a different way than most, as it focuses on the slow and inevitable deterioration of Alice's mind, mirroring the real-life effects of Alzheimer's. As the disease progresses, Alice is forced to stop teaching as her memory and cognitive abilities decline. She hides sleeping pills in her room, along with a note instructing her future self to take them if she can no longer answer simple daily questions. The novel also explores the strain the disease puts on her marriage, as her husband begins to see her as more of a burden. He struggles with the pain of watching his wife become someone he no longer recognizes, while she loses her ability to recognize him in return. Unlike other disturbing books that focus on violence or horror, Still Alice is unsettling because it presents a very real and deeply personal fear: the loss of one's identity and memories. Heart of Darkness is an 1899 novella by Joseph Conrad that follows Charles Marlowe, a steamboat captain tasked with navigating a river in an unnamed African territory, likely the Congo, to retrieve Kurtz, an ivory trader who has become an almost mythical figure. The story explores the brutal realities of European colonialism, depicting the exploitation and suffering inflicted on the native population. As Marlowe ventures deeper into the jungle, he witnesses the dehumanizing effects of imperialism and the psychological descent of those involved. While the book has faced criticism for its portrayal of Africa, it is widely interpreted as a critique of colonialism and the corruption of power. American Psycho is a satirical horror novel written by Bret Easton Ellis and published in 1991. The story follows Patrick Bateman, a wealthy young investment banker in New York, who embodies the shallow, materialistic, and detached culture of Wall Street in the 1980s. While much of his life revolves around business lunches, analyzing pop music, and obsessing over designer fashion, he also engages in brutal murders, at least according to his own narration. The book is told from Bateman's perspective, but he is an unreliable narrator. He presents himself as a sophisticated, methodical serial killer, but there are strong indications that his perception of reality is distorted. He murders his colleague Paul Owen and begins using Owen's apartment as a private killing ground. As the novel progresses, his acts of violence escalate from simple stabbings to graphic depictions of torture, cannibalism, necrophilia, and other extreme atrocity. Bateman's grip on reality continues to unravel, and he starts openly discussing serial killers in casual conversation, even confessing his crimes to colleagues who either mishear him or don't take him seriously. At one point, he says murders and executions, but his coworkers interpret it as mergers and acquisitions. His violent urges culminate in a shooting spree, after which he returns to Owen's apartment to clean up, only to find it spotless. There are hints that the building's owners erased all traces of the crime, not out of concern for the victims, but to protect the property's value. In the final moments of the novel, Bateman has yet another dull, surface-level conversation with his business associates, leaving the reader to question whether his murders ever actually happened, or if they were just fantasies born from the boredom of his privileged, monotonous life. The Haunting of Hill House is a Gothic horror novel by Shirley Jackson, published in 1959. The story follows Dr. Montague, a scholar of the supernatural, who invites a group of people to stay at Hill House in hopes of documenting paranormal activity. Among those who accept his invitation are Eleanor Vance, a quiet and emotionally fragile woman, and Theodora, a more free-spirited guest. Luke, the heir to the estate, also joins them. As their stay progresses, strange occurrences unsettle the group, but Eleanor seems to be the most deeply affected, struggling to distinguish between reality and the house's eerie influence. Others, like Dr. Montague's wife, arrive to investigate but fail to witness much of the supernatural events. What makes The Haunting of Hill House so unsettling is the ambiguity of its horror. Many of the frightening moments are left unexplained, allowing the reader's imagination to fill in the gaps. One of the most chilling examples occurs when Theodora urgently tells Eleanor to run and never look back after witnessing something terrifying, though what she actually saw is never revealed. The novel masterfully plays on the fear of the unknown. The Mysterious Stranger is an unfinished novel by Mark Twain, published posthumously in several different versions. The most complete and widely accepted version follows three young boys in an Austrian village who encounter a mysterious, supernatural figure named Satan. This character, who claims to be the nephew of the fallen angel, demonstrates his godlike powers to the boys, making prophecies and manipulating events in ways that challenge their understanding of morality, fate, and existence itself. At first, the boys are fascinated by Satan's abilities, but they soon realize that his sense of mercy is disturbingly literal. When one of their friends is prophesied to die of illness, Satan simply kills him outright, reasoning that it is a more merciful fate than suffering. Throughout the novel, Satan takes the boys on a journey through time and space, exposing them to human cruelty, war, injustice, and suffering, all while maintaining an eerily detached and emotionless perspective. His lessons force the boys, and the reader, to confront existential questions about free will, divine justice, and the nature of reality itself. The novel's most unsettling moment comes in Satan's final speech, where he declares that nothing truly exists. There is no God, no universe, no human race, no earthly life, no heaven, no hell. It is all a dream, a grotesque and foolish dream. Nothing exists but you. And you are but a thought, a vagrant thought, a useless thought, a homeless thought, wandering forlorn among the empty eternities. This passage encapsulates the novel's deeply nihilistic and unsettling tone, making The Mysterious Stranger a unique and chilling read. Unlike the loud, violent horror of other disturbing novels, Twain's story is quiet and philosophical, creeping under the skin in a way that lingers long after the last page. The Girl Next Door is one of the most harrowing and emotionally devastating horror novels out there. Jack Ketchum doesn't just write about violence. He forces you to experience the sheer helplessness and cruelty in a way that makes the book feel almost unbearable at times. Unlike supernatural horror, this story's horror comes from its realism, which is what makes it so disturbing. The fact that it's loosely based on the true case of Sylvia Likens makes it even harder to stomach. There's something about how the abuse is prolonged, normalized by the people around it, and escalates so disturbingly that it turns into a gut-wrenching read. Many readers say this book stuck with them for years, and not necessarily in a good way. It's the kind of novel that makes you question human nature. If you're looking for a truly disturbing horror book, this is it. Animal Farm is a novel by George Orwell, published in August 1945. It tells the story of a group of farm animals who rebel against their human owner in hopes of creating a fair and equal society. However, their vision of freedom is quickly corrupted when the pigs seize power, with one pig, Napoleon, rising to absolute control. As the new leadership takes shape, the ideals of the revolution are gradually twisted. The pigs manipulate language, rewrite history, and enforce oppressive rules while justifying their authority with slogans like, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." Over time, the animals find themselves in a dictatorship even worse than the one they overthrew. The novel is a powerful allegory, offering sharp political commentary on how power can corrupt and how revolutions can be betrayed. Lord of the Flies by William Golding is a classic novel that explores the dark side of human nature through the story of a group of stranded British schoolboys. What starts as an attempt to establish order quickly descends into savagery as fear, power struggles, and mob mentality take over. The novel presents Ralph as the symbol of civilization and order, while Jack represents primal instincts and chaos. The conflict between these two boys mirrors the struggle between structure and anarchy. As the boys abandon their initial attempts at democracy in favor of tribalism and violence, the story demonstrates how fragile social norms can be when faced with survival and fear. One of the most disturbing aspects of the novel is how easily the children embrace their violent tendencies. The murders of Simon and Piggy, both of whom represent wisdom and morality, highlight the novel's bleak outlook on human nature. The final chase scene, with the boys setting the island on fire in pursuit of Ralph, serves as a terrifying climax that only ends with the intervention of an adult naval officer. However, the officer's disappointment in the boys suggests an unsettling truth. The violence and savagery they displayed are not unique to children, but a reflection of the world at large, including the ongoing war outside the island. The novel has been widely studied in schools because of its themes of civilization versus savagery, leadership, the loss of innocence, and the psychology of group behavior. Its disturbing portrayal of how quickly order can collapse makes it one of the most thought-provoking and unsettling pieces of literature ever written. Blood Meridian is a 1985 epic novel by Cormac McCarthy. It follows a runaway teenager known only as the Kid as he journeys across the US and Mexico. After proving himself in a violent fight, he joins a group of US Army irregulars before being arrested. He is later freed by Toadvine, a member of the Glanton gang, who recruits him for their campaign against Native Americans. Initially, they target hostile groups, but their mission soon devolves into indiscriminate slaughter. The gang eventually turns to robbery in Arizona, but local resistance leads to their downfall, with most members being killed. The Kid is later arrested again and witnesses the execution of Toadvine in Los Angeles. Years later, now an adult, he encounters Judge Holden, a mysterious and recurring figure throughout the novel. Their final meeting ends with cryptic interactions and a shared moment watching a meteor shower. Richard Lehman is known for his straightforward slasher or survival horror, sleazy, pulpy edge, keeps the reader juggling different perspectives, definitely fits that bill, constantly shifting dangers. He's the kind of writer who throws everything at you: serial killers, psychological torment, sexual violence, and relentless tension, but in a way that feels almost like a roller coaster rather than pure nihilism. The multiple plot threads are what make this one stand out. Instead of a straightforward slasher or survival horror, Lehman keeps the reader juggling different perspectives and constantly shifting dangers. That sense of chaos, where you know these storylines will collide but have no idea how, adds to the suspense. The Diary of a Young Girl, also known as The Diary of Anne Frank. is a collection of journal entries written by Anne Frank while she and her family hid from the Nazis during the German occupation of the Netherlands. The diary has been translated into over 70 languages and is one of the most well-known personal accounts of life during the Holocaust. Anne wrote about her relationships with her family, her thoughts on the world, and her connection with Peter Van Pels, a boy she initially saw as a close friend and potential confidant. However, by July 15, 1944, she expressed that he could never truly be a kindred spirit. Tragically, Anne did not survive the war. Her father, Otto Frank, was the only member of the family to make it out alive. After the war, he received and later published her diary, preserving her voice for generations to come. Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee is a deeply unsettling novel, but not in the same way as the more graphic and shock-driven books we've discussed. Instead, it unsettles through its moral ambiguity, bleak outlook on humanity, and depiction of power dynamics, violence, and the lingering effects of apartheid in South Africa. David Lurie, the protagonist, is an English professor who abuses his position of power to coerce a student into a relationship. When he refuses to show remorse, he is dismissed from his job and retreats to his daughter Lucy's farm. However, rather than this being a redemption arc, things only spiral further into tragedy. The novel takes a brutal turn when Lucy is assaulted in an attack that leaves David physically wounded. Unlike him, however, she refuses to retaliate, choosing instead to accept her fate in a way that frustrates both David and the reader. What makes Disgrace so disturbing is not just the violence, but the way it forces the reader to sit with uncomfortable moral questions. David is an abuser, but he is not the novel's only, or even worst, source of cruelty. The world around him is full of injustice, both personal and systemic, and no one really escapes it. The novel examines the legacy of apartheid, the complexities of power and retribution, and the way violence can be cyclical and unresolved. Disgrace is the kind of book that disturbs on a quieter, more insidious level. It doesn't rely on excessive brutality, but rather on the inevitability of suffering and the unsettling idea that accountability and justice are rarely as clear-cut as we want them to be. Misery is a 1987 psychological horror novel by Stephen King. It follows Paul Sheldon, a successful author known for his best-selling Misery series. Despite the book's popularity, he despises the character and decides to end the series to focus on new work. While driving to Los Angeles, Paul crashes his car in a remote area and is rescued, or rather captured, by Annie Wilkes, a dangerously unstable woman who happens to be his biggest fan. When she discovers that he killed off Misery in the final book, she becomes furious and subjects him to relentless physical and psychological torment, forcing him to write a new novel, bringing the character back to life. As Paul fights to survive, Annie's behavior grows more unpredictable, leading to a tense and brutal battle of wills. Requiem for a Dream, 1978, by Hubert Selby Jr., is a devastating exploration of addiction, following 4 New Yorkers as their lives spiral out of control. Though widely known for its harrowing film adaptation, the novel itself is an intense and emotionally grueling experience, made even more immersive by Selby's unconventional, slang-heavy writing style. The story revolves around Sarah Goldfarb, her son Harry, his girlfriend Marion, and his best friend Tyrone. Each character begins with a dream. Sarah longs to appear on television, while the others hope to escape their circumstances through a heroin business. However, their ambitions quickly dissolve into addiction and self-destruction. Sarah's dependence on amphetamine-laced diet pills leads to amphetamine psychosis and a harrowing stay in a mental institution, while Harry, Marion, and Tyrone become consumed by heroin. Harry's drug use results in a life-threatening infection, leading to the amputation of his arm in prison, while Tyrone endures withdrawal and racial abuse behind bars. Meanwhile, Marion, left alone and addicted, resorts to prostitution for drug money, sealing her tragic fate. This novel is unrelenting in its depiction of addiction's destructive power. It offers no redemption, only a bleak, realistic portrayal of people trapped in a cycle they cannot escape. Trainspotting is a 1993 novel by Irvine Welsh, structured as a collection of interconnected short stories. It follows a group of friends in Edinburgh many of whom struggle with severe substance addiction. The book portrays the cycle of dependence, withdrawal, and relapse, showing how addiction impacts every aspect of their lives. Characters make reckless decisions, hurt themselves and others, and often face legal and medical consequences. The story is raw, chaotic, and deeply tragic, offering an unfiltered look at self-destruction and the difficulty of breaking free from addiction. And The Ass Saw the Angel, 1989, by Nick Cave, is a dark, surreal, and Southern Gothic-inspired novel that follows Euclid Ukro, a mute boy growing up in a deeply religious yet deeply cruel community. His mother is a violent alcoholic, and his father is obsessed with trapping and torturing animals, making for a nightmarish upbringing. As Euclid suffers abuse and isolation, his mind fractures, leading him into religious delusions, visions, and ultimately a violent reckoning with the people around him. Nick Cave's signature lyrical and almost biblical prose makes this novel feel like a fever dream, haunting, poetic, and grotesque. Themes of religious fanaticism, madness, and vengeance run throughout, with a heavy dose of disturbing imagery, including animal cruelty and self-destruction. The title is a reference to the biblical story of Balaam's donkey, which gains the ability to speak after seeing an angel that its owner cannot, a metaphor for seeing an unseen truth, or perhaps a divine madness. Born to Bleed by Ryan C. Thomas is the sequel to The Summer I Died, following Roger Huntington a decade after he barely survived the horrifying ordeal of the Skinny Man. Now attempting to live a normal life, Roger has a steady job and harbors feelings for his coworker Victoria. However, his fragile peace is shattered when he is forced into another violent and brutal struggle to save her. As he fights off her aggressors, he is once again plunged into a world of grotesque horror and graphic violence, facing the darkness both around him and within himself. Beowulf's Children, 1995, is a sequel to The Legacy of S0d0m by Larry Niven, Jerry Pournelle, and Stephen Barnes. The series is a mix of hard science fiction and survival horror, following human colonists on a distant planet called Avalon. In The Legacy of S0d0m, the first book, the colonists arrive on Avalon and struggle against a deadly native predator called the Grendels, highly adaptive, reptilian creatures that were originally thought to be harmless but turn out to be extremely dangerous. The book plays with themes of evolution, ecological balance, and the arrogance of humans assuming they can control a new world. Now, Beowulf's Children picks up with the second generation of colonists, kids who were born on Avalon and grew up in a much harsher environment than their Earth-born parents. These younger colonists resent their parents for being overly cautious and want to explore the planet more freely. This generational conflict leads to them venturing into the wild, where they encounter new threats beyond the Grendels, including more dangerous creatures and natural disasters, like the sandstorm you mentioned. The struggle between parental control and youthful recklessness, combined with Avalon's harsh environment, creates a tense, almost horror-like atmosphere. The series is classic, hard sci-fi with teeth, meaning it takes realistic science and biology seriously, but also delivers brutal action. The Resurrectionist by E.B. Hudspeth is a unique blend of gothic horror and anatomical illustration, presenting itself as both a fictional biography and a scientific text. The novel follows Dr. Spencer Black, a 19th century surgeon whose controversial theories and experiments take a deeply unsettling turn. Dr. Black proposes that mythological creatures, such as mermaids, satyrs, and harpies, are not mere legends, but actual evolutionary ancestors of humanity. His obsession with proving this theory leads him down a dark and twisted path, conducting gruesome experiments that blur the line between science and madness. The book is divided into two sections, the first being a chilling narrative about Black's life and descent into obsession, and the second featuring detailed, beautifully grotesque anatomical drawings of the creatures he believed once existed. The illustrations give the story an eerie sense of realism, making it feel like an actual historical document rather than a work of fiction. The Wasp Factory is one of those books that leaves a lasting impression, whether you love it or are completely horrified by it. Ian Banks' debut novel is deeply unsettling, not just because of its violence, but because of the cold, detached way that Frank narrates his actions. The book explores themes of isolation, gender identity, trauma, and the nature of violence in a way that was definitely controversial at the time, and still is. Frank's worldview is so bizarre that you can't help but be fascinated by it. The wasp killing ritual, the way he interprets the world through violence, and his twisted relationship with his father and brother all add up to something truly disturbing. And then there's the ending. Without spoiling it, it completely recontextualizes everything that came before it, in a way that's deeply unsettling but also brilliant. The scene with the baby and the maggots is one of the most infamous parts of the book. That, along with the animal cruelty and Frank's detached perspective, makes this a tough read for some people. But it's also a novel that has a lot to say beneath all the shock value. If you're into dark, psychological horror with unreliable narrators and a strong sense of dread, this one is worth checking out. Boot Camp 2007 by Todd Strasser is a chilling YA novel that exposes the dark reality of tough love correctional programs for troubled teens. While fictional, it's heavily inspired by real-life behavior modification camps that have faced serious allegations of abuse. The novel follows Garrett, a relatively normal teenager whose only real crimes are defying his strict parents and dating an older woman. His parents see this as rebellion and send him to Lake Harmony, a brutal reprogramming facility. The camp operates under a system of relentless physical, psychological, and emotional abuse designed to break the kids down until they conform. What makes boot camp especially disturbing is how plausible it is. Programs like this exist, and some have been exposed for using similar methods of extreme discipline, manipulation, and gaslighting to make teens obedient. The book doesn't rely on gore or horror, but instead creates unease through its depiction of control, helplessness, and systematic dehumanization. Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Bright is an extreme horror novel that delves into the darkest corners of human depravity. It follows 4 characters: Andrew Compton, a British serial killer inspired by Dennis Nilsson; Jay Byrne, a wealthy and sadistic murderer based on Jeffrey Dahmer; Lucas Ransom, a cynical radio host; and Tran, a Vietnamese-American runaway. Andrew escapes from prison in the UK and heads to New Orleans, where he crosses paths with Jay. At first, they are drawn to each other with a twisted desire to kill one another, but they ultimately decide to work together to find a victim instead. Their target is Tron, a vulnerable young man caught in their sadistic games. The novel is deeply disturbing, filled with graphic violence, necrophilia, and extreme psychological horror. It's not for the faint of heart, but it's also a darkly poetic and atmospheric exploration of obsession, death, and decay. Beloved is an absolute masterpiece, easily one of the most powerful and haunting books ever written. It's so much more than just a ghost story. It's about memory, trauma, and the lingering scars of slavery in ways that are deeply unsettling and heartbreaking. The ghostly presence of Beloved is terrifying, but the real horror is in the past that haunts the characters just as much as the spirit does. Toni Morrison's writing is incredibly poetic, but also gut-wrenching. Some parts of the novel feel almost surreal because of how trauma distorts memory and time. It's not a traditional haunted house story, more of a psychological and historical horror novel, but it will absolutely stick with you. If you read it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. It's one of those books that's even more powerful when you talk about it with others. A Child Called It is a 1995 memoir by Dave Pelzer that recounts the severe mistreatment he endured as a child until he was rescued by child services in the 5th grade. The book details the psychological and emotional struggles Pelzer faced as he went from being a beloved son to the target of relentless cruelty. Unlike his siblings, who were treated well, he was singled out for extreme neglect and punishment. His father, while present, was unable to protect him, and over time, Pelzer's relationship with his family became more complicated, especially as his brothers and classmates began to mistreat him as well. One of the few sources of kindness in his life was his teacher, Mr. Ziegler, who recognized his suffering and treated him with compassion. The story is a heartbreaking but important look at the realities of child abuse. While difficult to read, A Child Called It serves as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the need to protect vulnerable children. Last Exit to Brooklyn is a 1964 novel by Hubert Selby Jr. that paints a brutal and unfiltered picture of lower-class Brooklyn in the 1950s. Refusing to soften its depiction of poverty, violence, and suffering, the book presents 6 interconnected stories, each exploring the harsh realities of life in that era. Another Day, Another Dollar follows a gang of Brooklyn hoodlums who get into a violent altercation with soldiers on leave. The Queen is Dead tells the story of a transgender sex worker who faces relentless mistreatment from her homophobic brother. And Baby Makes 3 centers on a couple dealing with the challenges of having a child out of wedlock. Tralala focuses on another sex worker who ultimately becomes the victim of a brutal sexual assault, one of the novel's most disturbing moments. Strike follows a closeted gay man who abuses his wife and later joins a workers' strike, featuring scenes of sexual violence and pedophilia. The final story, Landsend, offers a broader look at the lives of various Brooklyn residents, capturing the bleakness of their everyday existence. Widely praised upon release for its raw and unapologetic storytelling, the novel remains infamous for its graphic depictions of violence and depravity. Night is a memoir by Elie Wiesel, first published in 1956. It recounts his harrowing experiences as a Jewish teenager during the Holocaust, detailing his time in concentration camps and the unimaginable suffering he endured. The book explores themes of faith, loss, and the darkest aspects of human nature. As Wiesel witnesses the horrors around him, he struggles with his belief in both humanity and religion. He grapples with feelings of resentment toward those he once loved, as the brutal conditions push people to desperate and heartbreaking actions. Beyond its historical significance, Night is a deeply personal and emotional account of survival, reflecting on the ways trauma reshapes identity and perception. It remains one of the most powerful first-hand testimonies of the Holocaust. Tiger Tiger is a memoir by Margot Fragoso that tells the true story of her long-term relationship with an older man who manipulated and controlled her from childhood into young adulthood. Their relationship, which began when she was 7 and he was 51, lasted for 15 years until his passing. The book is a deeply unsettling account of psychological manipulation, emotional control, and the long-lasting effects of grooming. Fragoso describes how she was isolated from her support system and influenced to keep the relationship a secret from those who could have helped her. While the subject matter is difficult, the memoir serves as an important exploration of how trust can be exploited and how manipulation can shape a person's reality. It offers insight into the long-term impact of such experiences. Salem's Lot is a novel by Stephen King, published in 1975. It follows the eerie transformation of the small town of Jerusalem's Lot, or Salem's Lot, as its residents slowly fall victim to a growing vampire infestation. The story centers on Ben Mears, a writer who returns to the town to research the Marston House, a mansion with a dark past that haunted him as a child. However, the house's new owner, Kurt Barlow, is far more sinister than anyone realizes. Posing as an antiques dealer, Barlow is actually a powerful vampire, while his business partner, Richard Straker, serves as his devoted human familiar. What makes the novel especially unsettling is how effortlessly Barlow spreads his influence. One by one, the townspeople succumb to vampirism, unaware of the creeping horror that is taking over their home. The Marbled Swarm is a 2011 novel by Dennis Cooper, set in the French countryside, following a deeply unsettling family. The narrator, who has a disturbing obsession with teenage boys, speaks in a secret language called the Marbled Swarm. Other families engage in similarly depraved activities, and the story only hints at the full extent of its disturbing content. In the Miso Soup is a novel by Ryu Murakami that follows a 20-year-old tour guide who makes a living escorting men to various nightlife spots in Tokyo. He is hired by a peculiar American tourist with an unsettling, almost artificial appearance for a 3-night tour. As their time together unfolds, the protagonist begins to suspect that his client might be responsible for a string of brutal murders happening in the city. The novel blends psychological tension with horror, creating an atmosphere of unease as the protagonist struggles to determine whether his suspicions are justified. The antagonist is especially disturbing, not only because of his violent nature, but also due to the eerie way he navigates an unfamiliar culture while potentially evading capture. The story explores themes of isolation, alienation, and the dark underbelly of Tokyo's nightlife, making it a gripping and unsettling read. The Cement Garden is a 1978 novel by Ian McEwan that begins with the death of a mother, leaving her 4 children orphaned. With the eldest only 17, they fear being separated by authorities. Their solution is to encase her body in cement and hide it in the basement. As they attempt to maintain a sense of normalcy, their isolation leads to increasingly disturbing dynamics, including an unsettling relationship between the protagonist, Jack, and his older sister. The novel explores themes of decay, repression, and the psychological effects of abandonment, making it an unsettling and deeply unsettling read. Such Nice People is a novel by Sandra Scopatone that takes place around Christmas and follows a deeply dysfunctional family, each member on the brink of something terrible. The main storyline focuses on one of the sons as he plans to murder his entire family, influenced by a strange, alien-like hallucination. The novel is a slow burn, gradually building tension rather than relying on non-stop action or gore. One of its most disturbing moments happens early on when the protagonist, in the grip of his hallucinations, goes to the shed. Spied on by his siblings, he strips naked, begins pleasuring himself, and then uses an old wooden plunger in an obscene act. While this is arguably the most grotesque scene, the book contains plenty of violence, especially in its climax. For those who enjoy psychological deterioration, religious hallucinations, and a creeping sense of dread, this novel offers an unsettling descent into madness. High Life by Matthew Stokoe is a dark and twisted noir novel that delves into the seedy underbelly of Hollywood. The protagonist, Jack, is a man obsessed with achieving fame at any cost. His quest begins after his estranged wife is brutally executed, prompting him to seek out her killer. However, he quickly abandons this pursuit in favor of something more immediately rewarding, becoming a male escort for the rich and powerful elite of Beverly Hills. Through his work, Jack is exposed to the grotesque and depraved lifestyles of the Hollywood elite, witnessing disturbing behavior that pushes his own moral boundaries. When he meets Bella, a wealthy woman with the power to make his dreams come true, his descent into darkness accelerates. But as is typical in Stokoe's work, things only get more disturbing from there. Maynard's House by Herman Raucher is a lesser-known novel that stands out more for its eerie atmosphere than for extreme or shocking content. It follows a Vietnam War veteran who inherits an old house in the remote wilderness. As winter sets in and he becomes snowed in, isolation begins to take its toll. The house itself carries a dark history. It was once the site of a woman's execution during the Salem witch trials. As the protagonist struggles with loneliness in the harsh winter, he begins to experience unsettling hauntings. However, it remains unclear whether these supernatural occurrences are real or if they stem from his trauma, PTSD, and cabin fever. I Am Legend is a 1954 novel by Richard Matheson that explores a world overrun by a vampire-like plague. The story follows Robert Neville, the last known survivor in Gardena, California, after a mysterious pathogen wipes out humanity, except for him. At first, the infected appear to be typical vampires, avoiding sunlight, fearing garlic, and being susceptible to wooden stakes. However, as Neville studies the disease and its effects, he begins to uncover deeper and more unsettling truths about the creatures and his own place in this new world. The Songs of Maldoror is a French poetic novel written by Comte de Lautréamont and published in 1868. It is a surreal and unsettling work that follows the musings and actions of Maldoror, a malevolent, almost demonic figure who revels in cruelty and chaos. The book is known for its disturbing and bizarre imagery. Maldoror either commits horrific acts himself or observes them with a detached, eerie fascination. One passage describes a man being bitten by a tarantula in his sleep, while another depicts Maldoror engaging in an unsettling encounter with a shark. There is also a scene where he deceives a man, lures him in, and then violently ends his life. This novel abandons conventional storytelling in favor of a nightmarish, dreamlike structure filled with surreal horror and philosophical musings. Its abstract and unpredictable nature makes it deeply unnerving. Gone to See the Riverman by Christopher Triana is a deeply disturbing, brutal, and unrelenting horror novel that explores obsession, cruelty, and the darkness lurking within human nature. The protagonist, Laurie, is obsessed with Edmund Cox, a notorious serial killer. She sends him letters, visits him in prison, and is willing to do anything to prove her devotion. When Edmund gives her a cryptic mission to find a man known as the Riverman and bring him something, she eagerly accepts. However, she brings along her mentally handicapped sister, Abby, for the journey. As they travel deep into the wilderness, the true depths of Laurie's depravity are revealed. She rationalizes her horrific actions, tries to justify her cruelty, and remains blinded by her infatuation with Edmund. The farther they go, the more nightmarish their journey becomes, both physically and psychologically. The Riverman's cabin, shrouded in mystery and menace, holds horrors that push the novel into extreme horror territory. This book is not for the faint of heart. It contains extreme violence, grotesque imagery, and deeply unsettling themes. It's a story about delusion, the justifications people make for their sins, and how evil festers when left unchecked. The Consumer is a collection of short stories by Michael Gira that delves into the darkest aspects of human depravity. Rather than focusing on a cohesive narrative, the book presents a series of disturbing vignettes featuring characters engaged in extreme acts of cruelty, obsession, and self-destruction. The collection opens with a story centered on incest, setting a grim tone for what follows. Other stories include two men taking drugs and descending into filth, graphic instances of animal cruelty, and a grieving husband who consumes his deceased wife's body as a way to stay connected to her. Further entries explore themes of torture, extreme self-harm, and grotesque addictions, pushing the limits of discomfort with every page. Rather than offering deeper themes or traditional storytelling, the book functions as an unrelenting descent into human misery. My Eyes Are Black Holes by Logan Ryan Smith follows Jack, a mentally unstable man trapped in his massive Chicago mansion. Traumatized by a lifetime of suffering, he refuses to leave his bedroom, but circumstances force him to navigate the house. As he moves through its corridors, the experience becomes nightmarish, blending psychological horror with surreal terror. Jack believes his half-open eyes possess the power of black holes, distorting his perception of reality. The novel delves into themes of isolation, madness, and existential dread, making for a deeply unsettling read. The Obscene Bird of Night is a highly acclaimed novel by Jose Donoso that forgoes a traditional narrative in favor of exploring deep existential themes. Rather than focusing on a linear story, the novel delves into ideas of isolation, transformation, and the nature of existence through surreal and unsettling imagery. At the core of the book is the myth of the Imbunch, a disfigured ape-like creature that has been bound, sutured, and sealed off from the outside world since birth. According to legend, all of its orifices are sewn shut, and its limbs are twisted to render it immobile, leaving it as a guardian of a cave. This disturbing concept serves as a metaphor for extreme isolation and what happens when a being is completely deprived of human experience. Clown in a Cornfield is a 2020 young adult horror novel by Adam Cesare. The story takes place in a rural town where tensions run high between the rebellious teenagers and the strict, traditional adults. Things take a deadly turn when a killer clown, who serves as the town's mascot, crashes a high school party and begins murdering the teens one by one. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that the clown isn't working alone. Despite being a young adult novel, the book features brutal kills and delivers on the classic slasher experience. It leans into campy horror, with stereotypical characters that seem intentionally written that way. The book has spawned several sequels and is set to receive a movie adaptation. The story's twist reveals that the murders are part of a larger plan by the town's older generation, who seek to reclaim their culture by eliminating the progressive youth. The Great God Pan is definitely one of those stories that was way ahead of its time. It's fascinating how something that was once considered obscene and horrifying is now looked at as a foundational piece of horror literature. You can definitely see its influence on Lovecraft, especially with the whole seeing something beyond human comprehension that drives people insane theme. Helen Vaughn is such an interesting figure. She's this eerie, otherworldly presence who doesn't do much outright violence herself, but her mere existence causes madness and death. The idea that she might be part human, part something else, is never fully explained, which makes her even creepier. There's something really effective about horror that leaves just enough mystery for your imagination to fill in the gaps. The opening brain surgery scene is also one of the most memorable parts. That whole idea of lifting the veil to see the true world is a big theme in horror. It's funny that people wanted to ban and destroy the book when it came out, but now it's considered a classic. The Bad Seed is a 1954 horror novel by William March. The story follows an 8-year-old girl named Rhoda Penmark, the only child of Christine and Kenneth Penmark. Rhoda is avoided by her classmates, who instinctively sense something unsettling about her. When one of her classmates, Claude, dies under mysterious circumstances, Christine is disturbed by Rhoda's complete lack of emotion. She soon discovers that Claude had won an award for his handwriting shortly before his death, something Rhoda had been jealous of. As Christine investigates further, she begins to recall other troubling incidents from Rhoda's past, including the unexplained deaths of their family dog and an elderly babysitter. Christine eventually learns that her own biological mother was a serial killer, a fact that had been kept from her. Convinced that she has passed down a predisposition for violence to her daughter, she struggles with what to do. Meanwhile, the building's maintenance man, one of the only people who suspects Rhoda's true nature, confronts her about Claude's death. In response, Rhoda waits until he is asleep, locks him in a shed, and sets his mattress on fire, watching with excitement as he burns to death. Christine witnesses this and finally confronts her daughter, only for Rhoda to show no remorse. Desperate to prevent her from growing into a serial killer, Christine secretly gives Rhoda an overdose of sleeping pills before shooting herself in the head. However, a neighbor hears the gunshot and saves Rhoda before the overdose can kill her. The novel ends with Kenneth returning home, devastated by his wife's death, while Rhoda, her crimes completely unnoticed, walks free, likely to continue killing without consequence. Child of God is a 1973 novel by Cormac McCarthy that follows Lester Ballard, a violent outcast in 1960s Tennessee. With no redeeming qualities, Ballard is a grotesque and depraved figure who descends further into isolation and brutality as the story unfolds. At the beginning of the novel, he is evicted from his home, which is later sold to a man named John Greer. Homeless, Ballard takes shelter in an abandoned cabin and begins spying on young couples. After being falsely accused of sexual assault and spending 9 days in jail, he stumbles upon a dead couple in an abandoned car while out hunting. He steals their money and commits necrophilia with the woman's corpse, storing her body in the attic of his cabin. When the cabin burns down, he moves into a cave. Ballard's crimes escalate as he murders a girl and sets her house on fire before taking her body back to his cave. He later kills a young couple in a car, once again stealing the woman's corpse. He attempts to murder John Greer, but is shot and wakes up handcuffed in a hospital. A group of men threaten to hang him unless he reveals where he hid his victims' bodies. He leads them to the cave but manages to escape deeper inside, where he is lost for 3 days before tunneling his way out. Soon after, he is captured and sent to a mental hospital, where he eventually dies of pneumonia. While the novel is disturbing in its subject matter, it is McCarthy's writing style that makes it especially unsettling. The story is told through Ballard's perspective, exposing his warped thoughts and depraved view of the world. The Invisible Man is a fascinating blend of early science fiction and psychological horror. What makes it so unsettling isn't just the idea of invisibility itself, but what it does to the protagonist, Griffin. He starts out as a brilliant scientist, but his descent into madness is what truly makes the novel disturbing. The moment he realizes he's completely untouchable, he abandons all morality, turning into a ruthless killer who believes he has the right to dominate others simply because they can't see him. H.G. Wells was ahead of his time in exploring themes of unchecked scientific ambition and the corruption of power. Griffin's invisibility isolates him from humanity, both physically and psychologically, and he ultimately loses all sense of empathy. His violent rampage, from theft to murder, is a chilling look at how absolute power can corrupt absolutely. The novel also plays with the idea of how society reacts to the unknown. At first, the townspeople are frightened and confused by Griffin, but as his actions grow more violent, they turn against him. In many ways, the book is a tragic tale. Griffin's genius is undeniable, but his lack of foresight and morality leads to his downfall. Compared to some of Wells's other works, like The War of the Worlds or The Time Machine, The Invisible Man leans more into horror, showing how terrifying it would be if an invisible person with malicious intent was walking among us. It's a short but impactful read, and it's easy to see why it's still influential over a century later. A Scanner Darkly is one of Philip K. Dick's most personal and haunting works, blending his signature paranoia-fueled sci-fi with a deeply human story about addiction, identity, and surveillance. Unlike some of his more traditional sci-fi works, this novel is grounded in the real-life struggles of drug use, inspired by Dick's own experiences and the people he knew who suffered from addiction. The novel's central theme revolves around the fragmentation of identity. As Bob Arctor becomes addicted to Substance D, his role as an undercover cop, Fred, and his life as a drug user begin to blur until he can no longer distinguish between them. The novel takes this idea to the extreme with the concept of split hemispheres. His brain literally stops communicating with itself, making him a prisoner of his own mind. This creates a unique kind of horror, where the protagonist is not only being manipulated by external forces, the government, Donna, the rehab facility, but also by his own failing perception of reality. The surveillance aspect of the book is another key source of unease. The world of A Scanner Darkly is one where nobody is truly free. Everyone is being watched, even the watchers themselves. The use of scramble suits, which obscure an agent's identity, even from their own colleagues, reflects the paranoia and detachment that pervades the novel. Bob is spying on himself without realizing it, reinforcing the theme of self-destruction. The ending is tragic in its irony. Bob, now mentally broken, is placed in the very drug-producing farm that the government was trying to expose. His final act, hiding a flower of Substance D in his shoe, suggests that even in his ruined state, some part of him is still fighting for the truth. However, it's left ambiguous whether his attempt to pass this information along will succeed, or if he's too far gone to be understood. Jose Saramago's Blindness is one of the most harrowing and thought-provoking novels about human nature, societal collapse, and the fragility of civilization. The book's depiction of an unexplained epidemic of blindness serves as a powerful metaphor for ignorance, selfishness, and the breakdown of social order. One of the most striking elements of the novel is Saramago's writing style, long, unbroken sentences with little punctuation, creating a breathless, overwhelming experience that mirrors the chaos of the story. The lack of character names, the doctor, the doctor's wife, the first blind man, etc., further dehumanizes the characters and emphasizes the universality of their suffering. The asylum sections are particularly brutal, showing how quickly desperation turns into cruelty. The moment when the women are forced to offer themselves to the gang in exchange for food is one of the most disturbing in the book, and it highlights how easily power imbalances emerge when the normal rules of society vanish. Despite all the horror, Blindness isn't completely devoid of hope. The doctor's wife, the only sighted person, serves as a moral anchor, showing that even in the worst situations, some people retain their humanity. But the novel ultimately raises a bleak question. Was society ever truly civilized to begin with? Or was it just a thin veneer that crumbled at the first real test? The sudden reversal of the blindness at the end is almost cruel in its abruptness. It leaves the characters in a world that has been reduced to savagery, with no clear path to recovery. Equus is one of those plays that really gets under your skin, not just because of its disturbing imagery, but because of the deeper existential questions it raises. The way it explores passion, repression, and the idea of normalcy versus raw, primal emotion is what makes it so unsettling. Alan's obsession with horses is obviously extreme, but the play almost suggests that his wild intensity is more alive than the dull, passionless world that Dr. Dysart is trying to push him into. Dysart's internal struggle is honestly just as fascinating as Alan's madness. His monologues about feeling empty and envious of Alan's raw, unfiltered passion make the play feel more like a tragedy than just a disturbing psychological case study. By the end, it's almost like Dysart believes he's murdering something essential in Alan by curing him. Alan's condition is definitely not one to romanticize. Blinding the horses is such a viscerally horrifying moment, but it's also symbolic of him trying to destroy the thing that sees his true self. Ring is a 1991 Japanese horror mystery novel by Koji Suzuki. It follows a reporter investigating a series of mysterious deaths linked to a cursed videotape. Those who watch the tape die exactly 1 week later under unexplained circumstances. The novel served as the basis for the well-known American film The Ring, though there are several key differences between the book and its adaptation. While the story includes elements of murder and sexual assault, it is not overly graphic or extreme in its depiction of violence. Despite its dark themes, Ring is more of a suspenseful mystery than an outright disturbing novel. Its influence on modern horror is significant, making it a must-read for fans of psychological and supernatural horror fiction. On the Beach is a 1957 apocalyptic horror novel by Neville Shute that explores the aftermath of a global nuclear war. The story follows a group of characters in Australia, one of the last habitable places on Earth, as nuclear fallout from the northern hemisphere slowly spreads southward, dooming the remaining survivors. A faint radio transmission is detected off the coast of Seattle, sparking hope that someone may still be alive, and a team is sent to investigate. However, the novel's most unsettling aspect is the sheer inevitability of extinction. The Australian government distributes super pills and lethal injections to spare people from the slow agony of radiation poisoning. One particularly harrowing moment involves a man pleading with his wife to end both her own life and that of their infant daughter. Despite its bleak premise, the novel provides its characters with a goal, making it more than just an exercise in despair. Flowers for Algernon is a novel by Daniel Keyes that tells the story of Charlie Gordon, a man with an IQ of 68 who works a simple job as a baker. He is given the opportunity to undergo an experimental procedure designed to significantly increase his intelligence. The procedure works, and Charlie rapidly becomes highly intelligent. But as he grows more aware of the world around him, he realizes that his relationships are deteriorating. The people who once treated him kindly now resent him, and the happiness he hoped to gain slips further out of reach. One of the novel's most striking aspects is its writing style, which evolves with Charlie's intelligence. Early sections contain misspellings and grammatical errors that reflect his limited understanding, but as his intellect grows, the writing becomes more sophisticated. This shift makes his transformation feel even more personal and immersive. While not disturbing, the novel is deeply tragic, exploring themes of isolation, failed relationships, and the consequences of seeking self-improvement. It also touches on difficult subjects, including childhood trauma. Despite its heartbreaking nature, Flowers for Algernon is a powerful and thought-provoking read. The story was originally published as a short story before being expanded into a full novel, and both versions are widely regarded as literary classics. Battle Royale is a Japanese dystopian horror novel written by Kushin Takami and first published in 1999. Set in a totalitarian version of Japan ruled by an unnamed dictator, the government tightly controls all aspects of life, banning any art or music that does not glorify the regime. As part of an experimental military program, 50 randomly selected classes of students are abducted, taken to a remote location, and forced to kill each other until only one survivor remains. The novel has had a major influence on pop culture, with The Hunger Games being one of the most well-known works to adopt a similar premise. Unlike that series, however, Battle Royale is significantly darker and more intense. While the violence isn't overly graphic, the sheer brutality of the premise and the emotional weight of the story make it a disturbing read. The book was also adapted into a film, which, despite its low budget and dated elements, remains a cult classic. Battle Royale stands out from modern dystopian fiction, which has largely shifted toward young adult audiences, by maintaining a raw and unfiltered portrayal of its grim subject matter. Black Easter is a fantasy novel by James Blish about an arms dealer who hires a satanic magician to unleash all the demons of hell on Earth for a single day. Set in 1960s America, the novel includes a depiction of the assassination of the governor of California, a character closely modeled after Ronald Reagan. Much of the book is dedicated to the detailed summoning rituals used to bring forth the demons, which made it highly controversial upon release. Given that it was published during the height of the 20th century satanic panic, its subject matter caused considerable backlash. However, the novel itself isn't particularly graphic, and its horror stems more from occult themes than explicit violence. Despite its provocative premise, the story focuses more on the rituals than the widespread chaos the demons could unleash. While it was shocking in its time, modern readers may find it relatively tame compared to contemporary horror. 1984 is a dystopian novel by George Orwell, published in 1949, that depicts a future society under totalitarian rule. The story follows Winston Smith, a worker at the Ministry of Truth, where his job is to rewrite historical records to align with the government's preferred narrative. The ruling party, led by the figurehead Big Brother, maintains absolute control by erasing dissent and criminalizing independent thought, branding those who oppose them as thought criminals. The party's ultimate goal is power for its own sake, enforcing obedience through constant surveillance, propaganda, and brutal suppression. While much of the novel focuses on psychological control and manipulation, later sections feature intense torture sequences that some may find disturbing. 1984 is widely regarded as an essential read, offering a powerful critique of authoritarianism. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is an 1831 novel by Victor Hugo, known for its dark and tragic themes. Set in Paris in 1482, the story centers around Esmeralda, a 16-year-old Romani dancer who becomes the obsession of multiple men, including Quasimodo, the deformed bell ringer of Notre Dame, and his cruel guardian, Archdeacon Claude Frollo. Frollo, despite his religious position, becomes consumed with desire for Esmeralda and orders Quasimodo to kidnap her. The attempt fails when Captain Phoebus, a soldier, rescues her, leading Esmeralda to fall for him instead. Later, when Frollo catches Esmeralda with Phoebus, his jealousy drives him to stab the captain. Though Phoebus survives, Esmeralda is falsely accused of his murder and witchcraft. Under brutal torture, she confesses and is sentenced to death. Just as she is about to be executed, Quasimodo rescues her and grants her sanctuary in the cathedral. While there, Frollo attempts to assault her, but is stopped by Quasimodo. Meanwhile, Esmeralda's mother, long separated from her, is revealed to be alive, but their reunion is cut short when the authorities capture Esmeralda. Her mother is killed in the struggle, and Esmeralda is hanged. Watching from above, Quasimodo, enraged, pushes Frollo to his death. The novel ends on a grim note, with Quasimodo later discovered in Esmeralda's crypt, having crawled in to die beside her. The book offers no happy resolutions, only a relentless sequence of tragedy and obsession. While it is regarded as one of the greatest works of French literature, it is far darker than its later adaptations, particularly the Disney version. The 120 Days of S0d0m is an unfinished novel written in 1785 by the Marquis de Sade while he was imprisoned. Known for its highly controversial content, the book follows four wealthy Frenchmen who retreat to an isolated castle, bringing with them a group of young captives. Accompanied by four women who share their past experiences, the men engage in a month-long series of increasingly extreme and disturbing acts. The novel is structured into four sections, each escalating in severity. The first section, Simple Passions, introduces various unsettling behaviors involving personal hygiene and unconventional practices. The second, Complex Passions, incorporates religious themes and inappropriate familial relationships. The third, Criminal Passions, describes acts of cruelty, exploitation, and physical harm. The final section, Murderous Passions, reaches the most extreme level, depicting severe mistreatment and tragic outcomes. Although never fully completed, its content has sparked discussions about morality, censorship, and the darker aspects of human psychology. This book is often referenced in discussions of extreme literature, but it is not recommended for the faint of heart. The Road is a 2006 apocalyptic novel by Cormac McCarthy that follows a father and his son as they struggle to survive in a devastated world. They travel along a single road, pushing a shopping cart filled with their few possessions, desperately searching for food while avoiding violent groups that hunt, steal, and resort to cannibalism. The novel is relentlessly bleak, capturing the desperation and hopelessness of their situation. The father, who is sick and knows he won't survive much longer, has taught his son how to take his own life if captured. The boy's mother had already chosen suicide, leaving the two to fend for themselves. Their only real goal is to reach the coast, not because they expect safety, but simply because they have nowhere else to go. One of the most disturbing moments in the book occurs when they stumble upon a cellar filled with people who have been chained up and partially eaten, used as human livestock. This horrifying discovery reinforces the brutal reality of their world. A film adaptation starring Viggo Mortensen was released, effectively capturing the grim tone of the novel. Unlike many post-apocalyptic stories that focus on action and heroism, The Road presents a more realistic depiction of survival, where starvation and fear are constant threat. Survivor is a satirical novel by Chuck Palahniuk that follows Tender Branson. The cult's doctrine dictated that its remaining members should live in servitude until receiving a sign to take their own lives. The novel takes a darkly comedic approach to its grim subject matter, frequently treating suicide with an unsettling level of detachment. As Tender gains fame, he becomes obsessed with making his eventual death as impactful as possible, holding off on ending his life until he reaches peak notoriety. This fixation is compared to playing the stock market, waiting for the perfect moment to cash out. One of the most disturbing moments in the book involves a character being ordered to disfigure another by repeatedly smashing their face with a rock. The victim actively encourages the attack, continuing until they eventually die from the trauma. Dracula is one of those books that has been analyzed and reinterpreted countless times over the years. On the surface, it's just a gothic horror story about a vampire coming to England, but underneath, there are a lot of themes: repressed sexuality, xenophobia, gender roles, and even fears of disease and contamination. The novel is structured as a series of journal entries, letters, and newspaper clippings, which adds a sense of realism to the horror. It follows Jonathan Harker, who visits Count Dracula's castle in Transylvania, only to realize he's trapped with a supernatural monster. Meanwhile, back in England, Dracula preys on Lucy Westenra, turning her into a vampire, and ultimately setting his sights on Mina Harker. This all leads to a dramatic chase where Van Helsing and his crew hunt the Count down before he can spread his influence any further. The character of Dracula represents the fear of the other, a foreign, powerful force coming into Britain and corrupting its women. His feeding on Lucy is often interpreted as a metaphor for sexual awakening, which Victorian society found terrifying. There's also a lot of homoerotic subtext, especially in the scenes where Dracula feeds on Jonathan Harker and other male victims. The End of Alice, 1996, by A.M. Holmes, is one of those books that push the boundaries of what a reader can stomach. It's deliberately disturbing, immersing you in the mind of an utterly repugnant protagonist, while simultaneously exploring themes of power, manipulation, and the grotesque nature of desire. If you're drawn to books that force you to sit with extreme discomfort, this one fits the bill. The way Holmes writes isn't gratuitous in the sense of shock for shock's sake. There's a clinical detachment to it, which almost makes it worse. The novel doesn't offer any relief or moral justification. It just forces you to witness the depravity in an unflinching way. It's not for everyone, obviously, but if you're interested in literature that delves into the darkest recesses of human psychology, The End of Alice is a brutal but fascinating read. It's the kind of book that sticks with you in a deeply unsettling way. Whether that's a good or bad thing depends on what you're looking for in a story. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is a historical novel by John Boyne, published in 2006. It follows Bruno, a young boy who moves with his family to Auschwitz after his father is promoted to commandant. Curious and unaware of the true nature of his new home, Bruno befriends a Jewish boy named Shmuel, who lives on the other side of a barbed wire fence. To Bruno, Shmuel's prison uniform looks like striped pajamas, and he does not fully grasp the grim reality of their situation. As the boys meet daily and share stories, Shmuel grows weaker due to the harsh conditions in the camp. In an innocent attempt to help his friend, Bruno sneaks into the camp, unaware of the danger he is walking into. The novel explores themes of innocence, friendship, and the devastating consequences of ignorance in one of history's darkest times. Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk is an insane horror novel that blends grotesque body horror with dark satire in a way that makes it both disturbing and absurdly funny. The book is structured as a series of short stories, all tied together by a bizarre framing device. 17 writers voluntarily lock themselves inside a theater, expecting to produce their best works. However, they soon realize that their suffering and self-inflicted hardships make for a much more compelling story than anything they could write. This leads them to sabotage their food and water, mutilate themselves, and even resort to violence and cannibalism, all in the name of creating the ultimate horror story. The novel is infamous for its opening short story, Guts, which is so disturbing that it allegedly caused people to faint during live readings. Guts describes 3 horrifying self-gratification mishaps, including one where a boy sits on a pool drain, only for the suction to begin pulling his intestines out, forcing him to chew through them to escape. Other stories in the book explore equally unsettling scenarios, often involving extreme body horror, grotesque accidents, and depraved human behavior. Despite its deeply unsettling content, Haunted is also highly satirical, poking fun at the way people sensationalize suffering for attention and art. It's a brutal critique of reality TV culture, media exploitation, and human desperation for fame. However, the sheer shock value of some of the stories makes it one of Palahniuk's most notorious books. Filth is a 1998 novel by Irvine Welsh that follows Bruce Robertson, a detective sergeant in Edinburgh. Bruce is a corrupt and depraved officer who spends most of his time using cocaine, drinking heavily, and abusing those around him while scheming against his colleagues. The novel is written in the first person, immersing the reader in Bruce's twisted mindset. As the story progresses, Bruce commits various crimes that his coworkers help cover up. His mental state gradually declines, leading him to take his own life in front of his daughter. His final regret isn't for his actions, but for failing to use his death as a way to hurt his ex-wife. Filth offers a disturbing but well-crafted exploration of a truly reprehensible character. The Story of the Eye is a 1928 novel by George Bataille, known for its extreme and transgressive content. It follows an unnamed narrator and his distant cousin, Simone, as they spiral into increasingly depraved sexual acts. The story begins with the narrator discovering unusual fetishes, such as sitting in a saucer of milk, which leads him and Simone into a world of exhibitionism and taboo desires. Their behavior escalates as they engage in violent orgies, which eventually push one of their friends to suicide. Rather than reacting with horror, the two have sex in front of his corpse. As the novel progresses, the characters' actions become even more extreme. In one scene, after a bullfighter is gored to death, Simone becomes aroused and inserts one of the bull's testicles into herself. Later, they seduce a priest in a church, desecrate a sacrament with bodily fluids, and ultimately murder him, removing his eye, which Simone once again inserts into herself. The novel is infamous for its graphic depictions of sex, violence, and religious desecration. It is often compared to 120 Days in its willingness to push the boundaries of morality and taste, making it one of the most disturbing works of early 20th century literature. Carrie is a 1974 novel by Stephen King about a high school girl with telekinetic powers. Raised in an extremely religious and sheltered environment, Carrie is relentlessly bullied at school. When she experiences her first period, she panics, unaware of what's happening since her mother never taught her about it. Her classmates mock her, leading to a punishment for those involved. One girl, Chris, refuses to accept the consequences and is suspended, which fuels her desire for revenge. Carrie is later invited to prom by Tommy, the boyfriend of one of the few classmates who feels guilty about how she's been treated. For the first time, she experiences kindness and joy. However, Chris, still obsessed with getting back at her, rigs the prom queen election and arranges for buckets of pig's blood to be dumped on Carrie and Tommy when they win. The blood drenches them, and Tommy is killed in the process. Instead of reacting with sympathy, the crowd laughs, pushing Carrie over the edge. Overwhelmed with rage and humiliation, she unleashes her telekinetic abilities, destroying the school and killing most of those inside. She returns home, where her fanatically religious mother sees her as an abomination and wounds her in an attempt to save her. In her final moments, Carrie kills Chris and her boyfriend before dying in the arms of the only person who showed her any kindness. Scorch Atlas by Blake Butler is a bleak and experimental take on apocalyptic fiction, known for its poetic yet disturbing prose. Unlike traditional narratives in the genre, it doesn't offer much in the way of hope, redemption, or even a clear goal for its characters. Instead, it presents a fragmented vision of a world ravaged by disease, decay, and surreal horror. One of the most unique aspects of Scorch Atlas is its physical presentation. Some editions of the book are designed to look weathered, burned, and deteriorated, reinforcing the themes of rot and destruction. The stories themselves depict grotesque bodily mutations, cities sinking into filth, and characters experiencing relentless suffering. While it shares similarities with The Road by Cormac McCarthy in its depiction of a desolate world, Scorch Atlas leans more into abstract, nightmarish horror rather than a conventional narrative about survival. Unlike the previous books discussed, this one doesn't seem to exist purely for shock value or to revel in depravity. Instead, it uses its disturbing imagery to create a uniquely unsettling atmosphere, making it more comparable to experimental horror or literary surrealism than outright transgressive fiction. The Conspiracy Against the Human Race by Thomas Ligotti is a philosophical work that explores themes of pessimism and nihilism. Ligotti argues that human consciousness is a tragic mistake, leading people to recognize the inherent suffering of existence. The book critiques the ways humans cope with this realization, from optimism to various societal constructs designed to distract from life's bleakness. Drawing from horror fiction, philosophy, and neuroscience, Ligotti presents a deeply unsettling perspective on existence, suggesting that self-awareness only amplifies suffering. Pet Sematary by Stephen King is about a burial ground that has the power to bring the dead back to life. However, those who return are not the same. They come back hollow, evil, and almost zombie-like. This is demonstrated when a man's 2-year-old son dies, and he buries him in the cursed ground, only for the child to return and terrorize his family. The novel explores eerie folklore surrounding the burial site and features unsettling horror elements, including a particularly disturbing scene involving a scalpel. There have been multiple film adaptations of the book, though their quality varies. The Yellow Wallpaper is a short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, written in the 1890s. It follows a woman suffering from postpartum depression, a condition that can occur after childbirth. Her doctor prescribes the rest cure, which involves isolating her from her child and confining her to a room with yellow wallpaper. This treatment, which was once commonly used, is now known to be harmful. As the story progresses, the woman begins to lose her grip on reality. She starts seeing a figure trapped within the wallpaper's pattern, and eventually believes she has become that figure. In the climax, her husband enters the room and faints upon seeing her in a deranged state. She continues crawling around the room and his body, convinced that she has finally escaped and become one with the woman in the wallpaper. Flowers in the Attic is a gothic horror novel by V.C. Andrews that tells the disturbing story of 4 siblings, an older brother and sister, along with a set of young twins. After their father dies in a car accident, their mother, desperate for financial security, returns to her wealthy family's estate. However, she reveals that she was disinherited for marrying her husband and having children with him. To regain her dying father's favor and secure a place in his will, she hides her children in the attic, keeping them a secret from him. As time passes, the children endure extreme isolation. It is eventually revealed that their mother was disowned because her late husband was actually her half-uncle, making the children a product of incest. Their deeply religious grandmother sees them as cursed and treats them cruelly, even cutting off their food supply at one point. In their isolation, the older siblings develop an inappropriate relationship, leading to disturbing events. Eventually, one of the twins dies, and it is discovered that they were being slowly poisoned with powdered donuts. The most likely culprit is their own mother, who was attempting to get rid of them entirely. Cows by Matthew Stokoe is one of those books that sits firmly in the realm of grotesque, transgressive fiction, designed to shock, disturb, and unsettle. It takes elements of body horror, extreme violence, and dark absurdism to create an experience that is both revolting and surreal. The novel follows Stephen, a man trapped in a nightmarish existence with his abusive mother, whose cruelty is beyond extreme. His job at the slaughterhouse further immerses him in a world of filth, cruelty, and insanity. As he descends deeper into violence and madness, the narrative shifts from brutal realism to surreal horror, featuring talking sewer cows that urge him toward more violence. While Cows contains themes of abuse, existential dread, and the dehumanization of modern life, it's also full of extreme and often ridiculous imagery, like the grotesque acts involving the live cows. Off-Season by Jack Ketchum is an intense and brutal survival horror novel. It follows a group of friends who travel to a remote location for a getaway, only to find themselves hunted by a savage group of feral cannibals. The horror begins when a woman is found in the ocean, claiming she was attacked by wild children, an eerie warning the group largely ignores. As soon as they arrive, things take a terrifying turn. One of their friends is brutally killed, and another is kidnapped. What follows is a desperate struggle for survival as the remaining friends attempt to escape the relentless, merciless attackers. This novel is infamous for its unflinching violence and disturbing themes. Zombie is a 1995 novel by Joyce Carol Oates that follows Quentin, a serial killer obsessed with creating a zombie, a completely submissive sex slave. The novel is inspired by the real-life crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer, who attempted similar methods on his victims. Quentin tries to achieve his goal through crude, makeshift brain surgeries, but each attempt fails. As his frustration grows, he begins to kill purely for the thrill of it. The book provides a disturbing look into his mind, showcasing his detachment from reality and increasing descent into violence. What makes Zombie particularly unsettling is its intimate portrayal of a killer's thoughts and methods. While it draws from real-life inspiration, Quentin has his own distinct motivations and techniques, making the novel more than just a fictionalized retelling. It's a short but chilling read that delves into the psyche of a truly monstrous character. Audition is a Japanese novel by Ryu Murakami about a widower who devises a fake casting audition in an attempt to find a new wife. What starts as a seemingly harmless plan soon takes a dark and unexpected turn. The novel was adapted into a highly acclaimed horror film, known for its unsettling atmosphere and disturbing imagery. Without revealing too much, the story contains a particularly infamous scene involving eye-related torture, which has left a lasting impression on many readers and viewers. The Turn of the Screw is an 1898 Gothic horror novella by Henry James. It follows a governess who is sent to care for 2 children, Flora and Miles, at an estate called Bly. The story creates an unsettling atmosphere and includes eerie supernatural elements, particularly involving ghosts that may or may not be real. Its ambiguity has led to much debate over whether the events are truly supernatural or a product of the governess's imagination. The novella has inspired various adaptations, including The Haunting of Bly Manor on Netflix. A Clockwork Orange is a 1962 dystopian novel by Anthony Burgess that was later adapted into a film directed by Stanley Kubrick. The story follows Alex, a violent young delinquent who, along with his gang, commits horrific acts of assault and brutality against innocent people. The novel contains extreme violence, including assault, and explores themes of free will and morality. Eventually, Alex is arrested and subjected to an experimental rehabilitation treatment that amounts to psychological torture. This aspect of the book introduces a disturbing layer of psychological horror as it raises ethical questions about forced behavior modification. The novel critiques both senseless violence and the societal structures that allow it to persist. One notable difference between the book and its film adaptation is that the movie omits the final chapter, which offers a more hopeful resolution. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket is a novel by Edgar Allan Poe, notable for being one of his few full-length narratives, as he primarily wrote poetry. Poe set out to prove he could craft a longer story, resulting in this dark and unsettling tale. The novel follows Arthur Pym, a stowaway on a whaling ship called the Grampus, who quickly finds himself in a series of harrowing situations. The book contains vivid depictions of murder, decaying corpses, and other disturbing imagery. While the subject matter itself may not be the most extreme, Poe's writing style creates an overwhelming sense of unease that lingers throughout the story. The Haunting of Hill House is a gothic horror novel by Shirley Jackson, one of the most influential horror writers in the genre. The story follows Dr. John Montague, who leads a paranormal investigation at the infamous Hill House. He invites individuals with past supernatural experiences, including the protagonist Eleanor. As the novel progresses, the house itself becomes a central mystery, with unsettling events that blur the line between psychological horror and the supernatural. While not overtly disturbing, the novel contains eerie and distressing moments, particularly as Eleanor's mental state unravels. The ambiguous nature of Hill House and its unexplained horrors add to its chilling effect. The book was loosely adapted into a Netflix series by Mike Flanagan, which incorporates elements from the novel while taking creative liberties. Girl, Interrupted is a 1993 memoir by Susanna Kaysen that recounts her time in a psychiatric hospital in the 1960s after being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. The book shares similarities with The Bell Jar, particularly in its exploration of mental illness and institutionalization. The unsettling aspects of the memoir stem from the author's paranoia and fragmented thoughts, which are reflected in the book's distinctive writing style. While not excessively violent, the novel includes disturbing moments, such as a scene where a patient chews through her own hand, convinced she has lost her bones. There are also multiple references to suicide and self, which may be difficult for some readers. Despite its dark themes, the memoir ultimately has a hopeful resolution, as Kaysen goes on to build a successful life after her hospitalization. Hell House is a horror novel by Richard Matheson, published in 1971. It follows Dr. Lionel Barrett, his wife Edith, and two mediums, Florence Tanner and Benjamin Franklin Fisher, who are hired by a wealthy man to determine whether there is life after death. They are given 1 week to complete their investigation. To find answers, they enter the infamous Belasco House in Maine, known as Hell House, due to the dark and twisted events that took place under its former owner, Emeric Belasco. The house is shrouded in mystery, with a history of unexplained deaths and the murder of Belasco's own son. As the group delves deeper into the supernatural occurrences, the house begins to manipulate them, preying on their fears and weaknesses. The novel explores themes of psychological torment, the unknown forces that may linger after death, and the price of uncovering hidden horrors. Elect Mr. Robinson for a Better World is a dystopian novel that follows a former schoolteacher who decides to run for mayor in a society where the education system has been completely defunded and extreme violence has become a normal part of daily life. Set in a bizarre and surreal future, the book explores a world where order has broken down and brutality is accepted as the status quo. The narrative blends elements of dark satire and absurdity, making it an unsettling but intriguing read. Due to its surreal nature, the story often feels disorienting, adding to the overall sense of unease. The Laws of the Skies is a 2019 fantasy horror novel by Gregoire. It follows 12 six-year-olds and their 3 adult chaperones on a camping trip that becomes their last. The story blends imagined horrors, such as trolls disguised as boulders and trees that consume children, with real-world suffering, including illness and a child descending into violent madness. They All Died Screaming is a horror novel with 2 loosely connected narratives that seem to focus on shock value above all else. The first storyline follows a mysterious disease that causes its victims to scream uncontrollably until they die. This part of the book revolves around a group of deeply unpleasant and morally bankrupt individuals who spend most of their time engaging in depraved acts. None of the characters are particularly likable. The second storyline follows a kidnapped boy who is forced to work on a farm. However, the farm isn't what it seems. It's actually a secret human meat operation where young girls are held captive, butchered, and sold as food. The farmer in charge is a monstrous figure who not only engages in murder, but also has disturbing interactions with the animals on his farm. As the boy grows older, he too commits horrific acts, reinforcing the novel's emphasis on depravity. Rather than being unsettling in a thought-provoking way, the book seems to prioritize extreme content purely for shock value. It leans into grotesque and transgressive themes, but without much depth beyond the sheer nastiness of its world. Some might see it as darkly comedic, while others might find it overly edgy without much substance. Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter is a psychological thriller centered on 2 sisters whose 3rd sibling disappeared as a teenager. The novel begins with a harrowing kidnapping scene and continues with graphic depictions of violence, torture, and assault, all described in unsettling detail. Karen Slaughter is known for writing intensely brutal stories, and this book is no exception. Despite its disturbing content, the writing is fluid and engaging, making the horrors feel even more immediate. Readers who enjoy dark, intense thrillers and can handle the heavy subject matter may find this novel compelling, but the explicit depictions of violence may be too much for some. Flesh and Blood is a 2014 novel by Patricia Cornwell, following Dr. Kay Scarpetta as she becomes the target of a mysterious sniper. With no idea who he is or where he might strike next, every move must be made with caution. As the sniper's victims continue to mount, Scarpetta uncovers more about his identity and a possible connection to her daughter, Lucy. Frankenstein, first published in 1818, is often considered the first horror novel. Written by Mary Shelley in the early 19th century, it tells the story of Dr. Victor Frankenstein, who creates a living being by assembling parts from dead bodies and bringing it to life. Horrified by his creation, he abandons it, leading to a tragic tale that follows both the doctor and the creature as they struggle to find their places in the world. The creature, shunned by society due to his terrifying appearance, grows resentful of his creator for making him this way. At its core, the novel is a deeply tragic exploration of isolation, rejection, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. While it contains disturbing elements, its horror is largely psychological, making it a groundbreaking work that shaped the genre. Room is a 2010 novel by Emma Donoghue, told from the perspective of a 5-year-old boy who has spent his entire life confined to a small room with his mother. The story is inspired by real-life captivity cases, though it is not a direct retelling. The novel explores the psychological effects of prolonged captivity, including the complex bond between the boy and his mother, as well as his perception of the world beyond the walls he has never seen. While the book does contain instances of physical violence, its most disturbing aspect is the long-term psychological trauma suffered by the characters. The story ultimately offers some hope, but it remains a heartbreaking depiction of survival and resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty. A film adaptation was released and received critical acclaim. Come Closer is a novel by Sarah Gran about a woman who begins hearing a strange noise in her apartment, eventually leading to interactions with a demon that seems to have taken up residence with her. What makes this book unique is its ambiguity. Readers are left to decide whether the protagonist is genuinely experiencing a supernatural possession or if she is descending into mental illness. The novel blends psychological horror with the paranormal, creating an unsettling narrative where reality itself feels uncertain. Weed Species is a 2006 novel by Jack Ketchum, inspired by the real-life crimes of serial killers Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. The story follows Owen and Jesse, a couple who commit horrific acts of violence. The novel delves into their psychology, offering a disturbing exploration of what drives people to such atrocities. Hog by Samuel R. Delany is one of the most infamous works in extreme literature. Written over the course of 3 decades and published in 1995, the novel is a relentless descent into depravity, pushing the boundaries of what is considered readable. The story follows a young, nameless boy who is sold into sexual slavery to a man named Hog, a violent and sadistic predator. Hog and his group engage in acts of extreme brutality, including graphic sexual violence, bodily waste fetishes, and the dehumanization of nearly everyone they encounter. The book is filled with relentless, explicit descriptions of horrific acts with no breaks for reflection or redemption. The setting, Pentopia, is a nightmarish world where abuse and depravity are the norm, and violence escalates constantly. Despite the subject matter, Hog is often discussed in literary circles because of Delany's skill as a writer. Some view it as a critique of violence, power, and human darkness, while others argue that its content is too extreme to be justified. Unlike other transgressive works that contain disturbing elements but still have a clear thematic or philosophical purpose, Hog offers little moral ground to stand on. It simply presents atrocity after atrocity with no reprieve. Peter Sotos is one of the most controversial figures in extreme literature, largely due to his obsessive focus on real-life abuse, exploitation, and murder. Proxy, a compendium of 5 of his out-of-print books, is notorious for its explicit, deeply unsettling content. Unlike other transgressive works that might explore disturbing themes with some level of detachment or critique, Sotos's writing is often seen as openly reveling in the worst aspects of human depravity. His works frequently blend fiction and reality, with some books speculating on the lives and motivations of real-life murderers and predators. Many argue that this crosses an ethical line, as he not only writes in graphic detail about abuse, but also appears to admire or glorify violent criminals. Let the Right One In is a 2004 horror novel by John Ajvide Lindqvist. It follows a 12-year-old boy who befriends a young girl, only to discover that she is actually a centuries-old vampire. While the premise may seem tame compared to other disturbing books, it contains several graphic and unsettling moments. The novel includes a character who disfigures himself with acid and jumps out a window in a attempt, only to be resurrected as a vampire. Enraged by his transformation, he later tries to attack a young vampire girl. Another character, after being turned into a vampire, chooses to end her own life by stepping into the sunlight. The book culminates in a violent scene where the vampire girl saves her friend from being drowned by 2 bullies, brutally beheading them in the process. Gemma is a 2006 novel that follows the story of a young girl facing incredibly difficult and unjust circumstances. The book portrays her journey as she is taken far from home and forced into a life she never chose. It explores the challenges she faces, the loss of control over her own future, and the emotional and psychological toll of her situation. What sets Gemma apart is its powerful and deeply emotional storytelling. While it deals with heavy subject matter, the novel is written with sensitivity and purpose, aiming to shed light on the struggles faced by vulnerable individuals. Unlike some other books that handle difficult topics, Gemma does not sensationalize or glorify the hardships it describes. Instead, it serves as a raw and unflinching look at resilience in the face of adversity. Perfume, The Story of a Murderer, is a 1985 historical novel by German writer Patrick Suskind. It follows Jean-Baptiste Grenouille, an orphan with an extraordinary sense of smell. Raised by a tanner, Jean-Baptiste discovers a scent unlike anything he has encountered before, a virgin girl's natural fragrance. Overcome by the desire to possess it, He kills her and remains with her body until the scent fades. Later, he apprentices under a perfumer, quickly mastering the craft due to his heightened olfactory abilities. Eventually, he grows disillusioned with society and retreats to a cave, where he realizes that he is unloved because he has no personal scent. Experimenting with disguising his own smell, he finds that people treat him better when he artificially mimics the scent of others. This revelation pushes him to create the ultimate perfume. He fixates on another girl with the same scent as his first victim, and over the course of a year, murders 24 other women to perfect his extraction technique. After finally killing his intended target and distilling her scent, he is caught and sentenced to death. However, just before his execution, he applies the perfume to himself, causing the crowd to fall into a frenzy of worship and adoration. Even the magistrate releases him, unable to resist his allure. The entire town descends into a mass orgy under the perfume's influence, only to forget the event afterward. Despite achieving the ultimate control over human perception, Jean-Baptiste is disgusted by humanity's weakness. He returns to Paris, pours the entire bottle of perfume on himself, and is immediately swarmed by a crowd. Enchanted by his scent, they tear him apart and devour him, believing they are acting out of love. Lolita is a 1955 novel by Vladimir Nabokov that follows the unsettling story of a man named Humbert Humbert, who becomes dangerously obsessed with a young girl named Dolores Hayes, whom he nicknames Lolita. The novel is framed as his memoir, written while he awaits trial for an unspecified crime. Humbert recounts his early life, explaining that as a child, he had a strong bond with a girl named Annabelle Lee, who tragically passed away. This loss leaves a lasting impact on him, shaping the way he views young people in an unhealthy and possessive manner. As an adult, after an unsuccessful marriage, he moves to the United States and searches for a place to stay. He comes across a widow, Charlotte Hayes, who offers him a room to rent. Initially uninterested, Humbert changes his mind when he meets Charlotte's 12-year-old daughter, Dolores, who reminds him of his past love. Wanting to stay close to her, he decides to move in. Over time, Humbert becomes fixated on Dolores, forming an unhealthy attachment. When Charlotte pressures him to either marry her or leave, he chooses marriage, not out of love but as a way to remain in Dolores's life. He secretly dislikes Charlotte and keeps a journal where he writes about his growing obsession. One day, Charlotte finds his journal and, horrified, plans to expose him. Before she can, she is tragically struck and killed by a passing car. With Charlotte gone, Humbert picks Dolores up from summer camp and, instead of telling her the full truth, claims her mother is sick. From there, the two travel across the country, with Humbert becoming increasingly controlling. He manipulates Dolores into staying with him, making it difficult for her to reach out for help. Though he sees their relationship as something mutual, the reality is much different. Dolores is confused, unhappy, and isolated, often crying at night and struggling with her situation. Eventually, they settle in a small town, but Humbert begins to suspect they are being followed. One day, Dolores falls sick and is taken to the hospital. When Humbert returns to check on her, he finds that she is gone. The hospital tells him that she was picked up by someone claiming to be her uncle, despite the fact that she has no living relatives. Humbert searches for her, but is unable to find her. 2 years later, he receives a letter from Dolores, now 17 and married, asking for financial help. When he tracks her down, he learns that after leaving the hospital, she had been taken in by a playwright named Claire Quilty. At first, she thought she could trust him, but over time, she realized he had bad intentions, and when she refused to participate in something she wasn't comfortable with, he abandoned her. Now married and expecting a child, she has moved on with her life. Humbert offers to take her away, but she refuses. He gives her the money she asked for and leaves. Fueled by anger, Humbert then tracks down Quilty, believing he is responsible for everything that happened. In a fit of rage, he confronts him at his mansion and ultimately takes his life. Shortly after, Humbert is arrested and, before passing away in prison, requests that his memoir be published. Lolita is often considered one of the most well-written novels in literary history, but its subject matter is highly unsettling. The book is not meant to portray Humbert as a sympathetic character, Rather, it exposes how manipulative and harmful he truly is. I'm Thinking of Ending Things is a 2016 psychological thriller novel by Ian Reid. The story follows a young woman traveling with her boyfriend, Jake, to visit his parents at their remote farmhouse. Throughout the trip, she contemplates breaking up with him. Told from her perspective, the novel slowly builds an unsettling atmosphere. Strange details emerge, including cryptic voicemails from an unknown caller who seems to be stalking her. The visit to Jake's parents' house is filled with eerie and disorienting moments, particularly a tense encounter in the basement. As the story progresses, reality begins to blur and the psychological tension intensifies. While the book contains themes of suicide and self-harm, most of its horror is psychological rather than violent. The creeping unease escalates toward the climax, making for a deeply unsettling read. Watership Down is a 1972 novel by Richard Adams that follows a group of rabbits who, while living in their natural habitat, are also anthropomorphized with their own mythology, culture, and storytelling traditions. Though it may seem like a simple children's book about rabbits, it is far darker than it appears. The story includes themes of survival, oppression, and violence, depicting the brutal realities of nature. The rabbits encounter a dystopian warren ruled by a tyrannical leader, and they learn that domesticated rabbits on farms are only cared for until they are slaughtered. The book does not shy away from death, showing the dangers the rabbits face from predators, humans, and each other. An animated film adaptation was released that has left a lasting impact on many viewers. With an art style resembling a traditional family-friendly cartoon, the film takes a shocking turn as the rabbits experience graphic violence, making it one of the most unsettling animated films ever made. The Amityville Horror is a 1977 book by Jay Anson that claims to recount the true experiences of the Lutz family, who moved into a house in Amityville, New York, after it had been the site of a gruesome mass murder. Prior to their arrival, Ronald DeFeo Jr. had killed 6 members of his family in the home, an event that serves as the book's horrifying backdrop. The story describes the paranormal events the Lutz family allegedly experienced, including everyone in the house waking up at the same time the murders occurred, a mysterious voice urging them to get out, and even a greenish-black slime creeping up the staircase. These supernatural occurrences eventually forced the family to flee. Despite its reputation as one of the most famous haunted house stories, the book's authenticity has been widely disputed. House of Leaves is a 2000 psychological horror novel by Mark Z. Danielewski, known for its unconventional storytelling and complex narrative structure. The story follows a man who discovers a manuscript analyzing a documentary that doesn't exist. Adding to the mystery, the manuscript was written by a blind man who could not have watched the film in the first place. The documentary within the manuscript supposedly follows a famous photographer who moves into a new home with his family. Over time, he realizes that the house is physically impossible. Its interior dimensions are larger than its exterior. What starts as a slight discrepancy of a few inches soon escalates as the house begins generating new rooms and endless hallways. Beyond the eerie premise, the book itself is designed to be unsettling. The text layout changes dramatically, with words twisting across pages or being buried in footnotes, reflecting the characters' growing disorientation. The manuscript also appears to have a psychological effect on those who read it, mirroring the paranoia and unease experienced by the characters. A particularly disturbing element comes in the form of letters from the protagonist's mother, who writes from a mental institution, describing the horrors she endures. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a novel by Ken Kesey, published in 1962. It follows a group of patients in a mental institution in Oregon, narrated through the eyes of Chief Bromden, a longtime patient who pretends to be mute. The hospital is run by Nurse Ratched, a strict and oppressive figure who maintains control through psychological manipulation and intimidation. The story begins when a new patient, Randall P. McMurphy, arrives. He has faked insanity to serve his sentence in the hospital instead of prison. His rebellious nature quickly puts him at odds with Nurse Ratched as he encourages the other patients to assert themselves, challenging the oppressive environment. A power struggle develops between McMurphy and Ratched, escalating as he attempts to inspire the men to reclaim their individuality. McMurphy tries to lift a massive mechanical control panel to break a window and escape, but fails. He later organizes a fishing trip, bringing along 2 women who are actually hired sex workers. The group steals a boat, and despite the reckless nature of the trip, it becomes a moment of freedom and camaraderie for the patients. However, Ratched retaliates by subjecting McMurphy and Bromden to electroshock therapy, which fails to break their spirits. One of the patients, Billy Bibbett, a timid man with a severe stutter and deep fear of his mother, expresses a romantic interest in one of the sex workers. McMurphy sneaks the women into the ward, allowing Billy to spend the night with one of them while the others throw a party. The next morning, Nurse Ratch discovers the mess and humiliates Billy by threatening to tell his mother. Overwhelmed with shame and fear, Billy kills himself by slitting his throat. In a fit of rage, McMurphy attacks Nurse Ratched and attempts to strangle her. He is subdued by the orderlies and later subjected to a lobotomy, which leaves him in a vegetative state. Chief Bromden, devastated at seeing what has become of him, ends McMurphy's suffering by smothering him with a pillow. In his final act of defiance, Bromden lifts the heavy control panel that McMurphy once tried to move, throws it through the window, and escapes the institution. The Virgin Suicides is a 1993 novel by Jeffrey Eugenides that tells the story of 5 sheltered sisters whose lives become the obsession of a group of neighborhood boys. The story is narrated by these men in adulthood as they reflect on the events of their youth. The novel begins with the suicide attempt of Cecilia, the youngest sister, who slits her wrists in a bathtub. Although she survives, she later jumps from a second-story window during a party and is impaled on a fence, dying instantly. This tragedy leads the girls' strict parents to become even more controlling, further isolating them from the outside world. Over time, the sisters become increasingly withdrawn, with one, Lux, sneaking onto the roof at night for secret encounters with men. The novel builds toward its tragic climax, in which the remaining sisters die in a group suicide. What makes the book particularly unsettling is the way the narrators view the girls. Rather than truly understanding their struggles, the boys remain fixated on them as objects of desire, even as they descend into isolation and despair. The novel's eerie tone comes not just from the tragic fates of the sisters, but from the detached and almost voyeuristic way their story is told. It explores themes of repression, obsession, and the way tragedy is often misunderstood or even mythologized by those who witness it. Tender as the Flesh is a 2020 dystopian novel by Argentinian author Agustina Basterrica. It takes place in a world where animal meat is no longer safe to eat due to a virus, leading to the mass production and consumption of human meat. The story follows a man who works as the operations director of a human meat processing plant. The first half of the book details the industry's brutal practices. Humans are bred in captivity, have their vocal cords removed, and are branded each year. Women are forcibly impregnated, and men are used solely for reproduction. Before slaughter, humans are stunned with a blow to the head, and the processing of their bodies is described in disturbing detail. Child meat is considered a delicacy, and some people are sold to private buyers who gradually carve them up while keeping them alive for as long as possible. As the novel progresses, the protagonist becomes increasingly disturbed by the industry and stops eating human meat. He is eventually gifted a live female whom he chooses not to slaughter. Instead, he keeps her locked away and later impregnates her, setting up a bleak and unsettling conclusion. The novel is deeply disturbing, not just because of its gruesome premise, but also because of the clear parallels it draws to modern factory farming. While not an explicitly anti-meat novel, it forces readers to confront the ethics of mass food production. With its bleak tone and graphic descriptions, Tender as the Flesh is a harrowing read that leaves a lasting impact. A Little Life is a 2015 novel by Hanya Yanagihara that follows the lives of 4 friends, though the story primarily focuses on one character, Jude St. Francis. Jude endures an existence filled with relentless suffering, never experiencing lasting happiness. Whenever something positive happens in his life, it is quickly taken away. The novel delves into themes of trauma, abuse, and self-destruction. Jude is subjected to extreme physical violence, human trafficking, and repeated sexual assault. He also struggles with severe self-harm and self-mutilation. The book does not offer moments of relief or hope, but instead presents an unflinching portrayal of his pain, with little emphasis on recovery or resilience. Unlike many narratives that explore trauma, this novel does not attempt to be inspirational. It instead focuses on the inevitability of Jude's suffering, leaving the reader to witness his decline. The writing is deeply emotional and immersive, making it a difficult but powerful read. Piercing is a Japanese novel about a man who struggles with an uncontrollable urge to kill a baby using an ice pick. The story is filled with violence, both committed by the protagonist and inflicted upon him. Most of the novel follows his internal battle as he tries to convince himself to go through with murdering a sex worker. However, he soon realizes that she is just as disturbed as he is, turning their encounter into a tense game of cat and mouse. The book contains many metaphors that blur the lines between violence and sexuality. In 2018, it was adapted into a film that received positive reviews from critics. While the novel is undeniably disturbing, featuring graphic depictions of stabbings, self-harm, and mutilation, it stands out because its protagonist is not met with helpless victims, but rather with someone equally dangerous. The Resort by Bentley Little is a novel about a family vacationing at a luxurious 5-star resort, only to realize that something is terribly wrong. They begin witnessing strange and unsettling occurrences, from ghostly apparitions to a corpse at the bottom of the pool. The book shares similarities with The Shining, but what sets it apart is its sudden tonal shifts. Without warning, the narrative dives into grotesque and explicit descriptions of violence, sexual depravity, and ritual sacrifices. Bentley Little is known for this kind of writing, blending horror with an almost absurd level of brutality. The novel doesn't discriminate in its violence. Both men and women are subjected to horrific fates, which is somewhat unusual in disturbing fiction, where victimization is often one-sided. One particularly brutal scene involves a woman being hacked to death with hatchets, described in graphic and unsettling detail. These moments often come out of nowhere, adding to the novel's unpredictability. Despite its extreme content, The Resort has a pulpy, almost darkly comedic edge, making its more shocking elements feel surreal rather than purely oppressive. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is an 1886 Gothic horror novel by Robert Louis Stevenson. The story follows Gabriel Utterson as he investigates strange events involving his old friend, Dr. Henry Jekyll, and a violent criminal named Edward Hyde. Hyde is a cruel and remorseless man who tramples a young and later beats someone to death. As Utterson digs deeper, he discovers Jekyll's will, which oddly leaves everything to Hyde. This raises suspicion, and his investigation eventually leads him to Jekyll's laboratory, where he finds Hyde dead in what appears to be suicide. It is then revealed that Jekyll had created a potion that allowed him to transform into Hyde, indulging in his darkest impulses without consequence. However, the transformation becomes uncontrollable, and realizing that he will eventually become Hyde permanently, Jekyll leaves behind a letter explaining everything. Living Dead Girl is a 2008 novel by Elizabeth Scott that follows a 15-year-old girl named Alice, who has been held captive for 5 years by a man named Ray. The outside world assumes he is her father, but in reality, he abducted her, starved her, forced her to wear children's clothing, and subjected her to constant abuse. Alice believes that any attempt to escape will lead to her family's death. Ray had previously kidnapped another girl he also called Alice, whom he murdered when she began to mature. Now, he forces the current Alice to find a new victim to take her place. She identifies a girl named Lucy at the park, but hesitates to go through with it. In an attempt to gather more information, she seduces Lucy's older brother. A police officer notices Alice and senses that something is wrong, but the situation remains unresolved. Alice eventually decides to warn Lucy about Ray, but he catches her in the act and begins strangling her. Before he can kill her, Lucy's brother shoots and kills him. Alice is mortally wounded in the struggle, but as she dies, she feels relief, finally free from the torment she endured. Thirsty is a 1997 horror novel by M.T. Anderson about a teenage boy who discovers he is turning into a vampire. The book explores common vampire themes, such as an uncontrollable thirst for blood, which leads him to hunt and kill animals in a desperate attempt to satisfy his cravings. One of the novel's standout aspects is its well-developed vampire mythology. It introduces the legend of an ancient vampire sealed beneath the town, who can only be destroyed with a specific relic. While the story contains dark elements, it leans more toward young adult horror rather than extreme psychological or graphic content. The protagonist struggles with the inevitability of his transformation, creating a sense of hopelessness, but the novel is more of a unique take on vampire lore than a deeply disturbing read. Coin Locker Babies is a Japanese novel by Ryu Murakami that follows two boys who were abandoned as infants in coin lockers and later grow up in the foster care system. The novel is known for its surreal, fever dream-like narrative, blending disturbing elements with bizarre and unexpected plot developments. Throughout the story, there are several shocking moments, including a character who shoots and kills his own mother, and another who attempts to tear a woman apart with his bare hands, starting with her mouth. The novel also features a dystopian city turned into a toxic wasteland. However, alongside these dark themes, there are strange and almost absurd elements, such as one of the protagonists becoming a pop star and another character transforming her condo into a swamp for her pet crocodile. While the book contains unsettling moments, its disorienting and surreal storytelling often leaves readers more bewildered than horrified. Tampa by Alyssa Nutting is a novel that delves into the mind of a complex and deeply flawed character, a teacher whose actions cross serious ethical boundaries. The story is written as a psychological drama with elements of dark humor, exploring the consequences of her choices and the way society responds to situations like hers. The book was inspired by real-life events that the author was familiar with, which shaped her perspective on how these issues are often misunderstood. Through the main character, Nutting examines themes of responsibility, power dynamics, and the way different situations are perceived by those involved. One of the most striking aspects of the novel is how it highlights the importance of recognizing and addressing inappropriate behavior, regardless of circumstances. The Slug is a 2004 novel that revolves around an online forum obsessed with Brad, a gay sex worker. The forum members fixate on uncovering his true identity while indulging in disturbing discussions about extreme and depraved acts. The novel is presented as a series of forum posts, creating a fragmented and unreliable narrative. Brad is being exploited by his abusive partner, but instead of trying to help him, the forum users treat him as an object of fantasy and speculation. His physical description constantly shifts, making it unclear if any of the information about him is real. The book explores unsettling themes, including castration, necrophilia, snuff, and bug chasing, the practice of intentionally seeking out sexually transmitted diseases. The novel won the S0d Prize, an award for particularly controversial and provocative literature, named after the Marquise de Sade. One of its most unsettling aspects is how it mirrors real online communities where extreme fixations thrive in anonymity. Despite being written in 2004, the book feels eerily relevant to the way niche internet subcultures form and feed off their darkest desires. Out is such a brutal and unflinching look at crime, desperation, and the way society pushes people, especially women, into impossible situations. It's not just about the crime itself, but about how the characters are shaped by their circumstances, forced into darkness by financial struggles, abuse, and the sheer weight of their lives. The dismemberment scene is definitely one of the most unsettling parts, but what makes it even worse is how matter-of-fact it is. There's no dramatic horror movie build-up, it's just this grim, practical process, which somehow makes it feel even more real. I think what makes Out stand out from other crime novels is how deeply psychological it is. It doesn't just focus on the act of violence, but on the way it transforms the people involved. The moral decay, the shifting power dynamics, the growing numbness, it's almost scarier than the physical violence. Coraline is a dark fantasy novel by Neil Gaiman about a girl who feels dissatisfied with her ordinary life. She discovers a hidden door in her home that usually leads to a brick wall, But one day, it opens into an alternate world. In this world, her parents are more attentive, and everything seems more exciting, including her toys. However, her other mother demands that she sew buttons over her eyes to stay permanently and become like the rest of the inhabitants. When Coraline refuses and escapes, her real parents are kidnapped, forcing her to return and face the other mother to rescue them. Through a series of dangerous encounters, she ultimately outsmarts the sinister forces of the other world and saves her family. Gerald's Game is a 1992 psychological horror novel by Stephen King. It follows Jessie, a woman who is handcuffed to a bed by her husband Gerald during an intimate encounter. When Gerald crosses a boundary and tries to force himself on her, she fights back, causing him to suffer a fatal heart attack. Trapped and alone in a remote cabin, Jessie struggles to escape while battling hallucinations, repressed memories, and her own fractured mind. As she becomes increasingly desperate, she also encounters a disturbing figure known as the Space Cowboy, leaving her to question whether he is real or just another manifestation of her deteriorating mental state. The Painted Bird is a 1965 novel by Jerzy Kosinski that follows a young boy wandering through Central Europe during World War II. Abandoned by his parents, he is often mistaken for being Jewish and is subjected to relentless cruelty. The novel is an unflinching portrayal of human brutality, depicting a series of horrific events that befall the boy as he struggles to survive. The book contains extreme instances of violence, brutal abuse, and dehumanization. In one scene, the boy is buried up to his neck in dirt by a woman and then attacked by birds. Elsewhere, a woman frequently exposes herself to a boy, leading to her husband violently beating her and gouging out the boy's eyes. Animal abuse is a recurring theme, adding to the novel's overall sense of relentless suffering. One of the most harrowing moments involves a woman who is sexually assaulted by a group of men, leaving her mentally broken. She later attempts to assault the protagonist, which leads to the men of the village attacking and molesting her in retaliation. Afterward, she is beaten to death by the wives of her attackers. This novel is unrelenting in its depiction of human cruelty, making it one of the most disturbing books on this list. The Troop by Nick Cutter is a horror novel about a group of Boy Scouts who set out on a camping trip to an uninhabited island, only to encounter a man infected with a deadly parasite. As the infection spreads, the boys face horrifying physical and psychological ordeals. The novel is disturbing not just for its body horror and gruesome depictions of self-mutilation, but also for an extended sequence in which two characters attempt to kill a sea turtle. The book contains unsettling moments of characters consuming things they shouldn't, including their own fingernails and skin. One of the boys is also a complete psychopath. Though not the most extreme horror novel, The Troop delivers plenty of unsettling moments and a claustrophobic sense of dread. It's a relatively short read, but one that might make readers think twice about venturing into the wilderness. All Tomorrows is a 2006 science fiction work that explores a speculative future of human evolution. The most disturbing aspect of the book comes from its depiction of extreme body horror. In this future, a powerful alien race genetically alters humans, reshaping them into grotesque forms they consider superior. Many of these transformed beings are barely recognizable as human, are turned into massive, elephantine beings with human features but no ability to communicate. One of the most unsettling fates is that of the Colonials, a group of humans who resisted the alien overlords and were subjected to the cruelest punishment. They were transformed into mindless, fleshy bottom feeders, still capable of thought and suffering, but forced to live as biological waste consumers. This torment lasted for 40 million years, with each generation born into endless misery. When the alien species eventually abandoned them, they hoped these creatures would die off, but instead, they survived and multiplied, covering their planet in a massive, suffering mass of flesh. Their fate mirrors the eternal torment of the protagonist in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Inferno is the first part of the Divine Comedy, a 14th century epic poem by Dante Alighieri. It follows Dante, who finds himself lost in a dark forest, his path blocked by three beasts. He is rescued by the Roman poet Virgil, who was sent by the Virgin Mary and Saint Lucia to guide him through hell. Dante and Virgil descend through the 9 circles of hell, where sinners endure punishments that correspond to their crimes. Each level grows increasingly severe, from the lustful being tossed by violent winds to the violent being submerged in a river of boiling blood and fire. The journey serves as both a literal and allegorical exploration of sin, justice, and redemption. The Cabin at the End of the World is a 2018 horror novel by Paul Tremblay that follows a couple and their adopted daughter as they vacation at a remote lakeside cabin. Their peaceful retreat is shattered when 4 strangers break in and present them with a horrifying ultimatum. 2 of them must sacrifice the other to prevent the apocalypse. The novel plays with psychological tension, keeping the reader uncertain about whether the strangers are telling the truth or simply delusional. The story contains several gruesome deaths, and the involvement of a child as one of the potential victims heightens the emotional weight of the situation. One of the most disturbing moments in the book is the violent and accidental death of the young girl, which leaves the remaining characters in a state of grief and shock. This moment is particularly difficult to read because she is well developed as a character, making her loss even more impactful. The book was adapted into the film Knock at the Cabin, which made significant changes to the story, including sparing the daughter's life. Last Days is a 2012 found-footage-style horror novel about a man hired to make a documentary on a doomsday cult that ended in a dramatic and bloody massacre. The story draws inspiration from real-life cults and uses the documentary format as an engaging framing device. Most of the novel focuses on uncovering the disturbing history of the cult, with chilling details about murder, squalid living conditions, and members being forced into prostitution to recruit new followers. One of the most unsettling parts comes late in the book, when the cult's origins are revealed, involving horrifying events from centuries earlier. However, the book takes a drastic turn in its final act, shifting into an over-the-top action sequence, reminiscent of a Resident Evil game, complete with a gun-wielding American character and what is essentially a zombie-infested compound. This shift in tone makes the ending feel disconnected from the eerie and slow-building horror of the rest of the novel. The Moth Diaries is a 2002 gothic horror novel that follows a teenage girl living at a boarding school in the aftermath of her father's suicide. The novel is written in diary format, offering an intimate look into the protagonist's mind as she navigates grief, social isolation, and paranoia. The disturbing aspects of the book stem from its raw depiction of self-harm, suicide, and the protagonist's increasing despair as she watches her close friends grow distant or meet tragic fates. A new student arrives and begins to take over her social circle, while eerie accidents and deaths begin to occur, creating an unsettling sense of psychological horror. The book also introduces a supernatural element, as the new girl is subtly suggested to be a vampire. While the novel is more about emotional distress and psychological horror than outright gore or terror, its unconventional storytelling and the blending of diary-style narration with gothic horror make it a unique read. Happily Ever After by Matt Shaw is a psychological horror novel that follows Peter, a man struggling with internet banking who frequently seeks help from a customer service representative. Over the course of several weeks, he develops an obsession with her. However, Peter is far from ordinary, and his fixation takes a dark turn. Unbeknownst to her, he has been preparing a secluded space on his mother's old farm, intending to bring her there. Eventually, he kidnaps her, forcing her into a terrifying struggle for survival, where she must do whatever it takes to appease him. Rage is one of the most infamous books in Stephen King's bibliography, mainly because of its subject matter and its connection to real-life events. The novel was originally published under his Richard Bachman pseudonym, but after it was linked to multiple school shootings, King made the decision to pull it from publication. Unlike a lot of his work, Rage isn't supernatural horror. It's a psychological thriller that digs into the mind of a disturbed teenager, which makes it all the more unsettling. The story follows Charlie Decker, a high school student who, after being expelled, takes his classmates hostage at gunpoint. But rather than being a straightforward shooter scenario, the novel shifts into a bizarre psychological standoff. where the hostages start sympathizing with Charlie and even turning against one of their own, a popular jock named Ted. The way the class transforms into this twisted group therapy session is one of the most disturbing elements of the book, especially with how easily they start justifying the violence. Naked Lunch is one of those books that defies traditional storytelling. It's more of an experience than a linear narrative. William S. Burroughs wrote it in a highly fragmented, hallucinatory style, which makes sense given that he was deep into drug addiction at the time. The novel jumps between grotesque vignettes, disturbing imagery, and satirical critiques of bureaucracy, law enforcement, and control systems. The book's reputation as a transgressive classic comes from its surreal and often horrifying depictions of addiction, sex, and violence. The talking anus scene you mentioned is one of the most infamous parts. Burroughs often used grotesque body horror to explore themes of power, dependency, and the dehumanizing effects of addiction. Some parts of Naked Lunch read like a drug-induced nightmare, which was exactly his intention. It was also one of the most controversial books of its time. Outer Dark by Cormac McCarthy follows the harrowing story of a woman who gives birth to her brother's child. While she is recovering, her brother abandons the baby in the woods to avoid responsibility. The novel then splits into two narratives, one following the brother and the other following the sister. The brother searches for work, taking on various jobs while being repeatedly accused of crimes and pursued by a trio of mysterious men who seem to kill anyone who poses a threat to him. Fearing they will eventually come for him, he remains on the run. Toward the end, he finds his son, who has been severely burned on one side of his body and is missing an eye. The three men finally catch up to him, accuse him of abandoning the child, then kill and eat the boy. The sister sets out to find her baby, after discovering an empty grave near her home. She follows the child's trail until she meets a man who had found and taken in the abandoned infant. He refuses to return the child, believing she forfeited her right to him. After staying with another man for a time, she eventually comes across the bodies of both the child and the man who had taken him in. Lunar Park is a 2005 novel by Bret Easton Ellis that begins as a semi-autobiographical account before spiraling into fiction. The protagonist, a version of Ellis himself, narrates his life as a successful but troubled author. However, as the story progresses, reality begins to unravel and supernatural elements emerge. Haunted by figures from his past, including characters from his own books, Ellis finds himself trapped in a surreal and unsettling narrative where the lines between fiction and reality blur. The novel blends psychological horror, satire, and metafiction, creating a uniquely disorienting experience. 2666 is the final novel by Roberto Bolaño, spanning over 1,100 pages and centered around a series of more than 300 murders in a fictional city inspired by the real-life Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. The book is divided into 5 sections, each following different characters as they navigate the city's grim reality. What makes the novel particularly disturbing is its relentless, detailed descriptions of the murdered women. Hundreds of pages are dedicated to depicting how they were killed, while the authorities remain largely incompetent, failing to catch the perpetrator. The novel highlights the real-world issue of femicide, a crisis that continues to plague Mexico. The meaning behind the title 2666 remains a mystery, as Bolaño died before the book's full publication. This Sweet Sickness by Patricia Highsmith is a psychological thriller that thrives on obsession and delusion, rather than outright gore or shock value. Compared to the extreme books discussed earlier, this novel feels more grounded in reality, which in some ways makes it even more unsettling. David Kelsey is a textbook stalker, charming and intelligent on the surface, but deeply unhinged. His love for Annabelle isn't just unreciprocated, it's entirely fabricated in his mind. His ability to twist reality to fit his narrative, despite all evidence to the contrary, makes him a truly terrifying character. What makes this novel so eerie is how Highsmith captures the slow, suffocating buildup of his obsession. He isn't a stereotypical horror villain. He's someone who believes with full conviction that he's the good guy in a love story, which makes his actions all the more disturbing. One of Highsmith's strengths is her ability to create protagonists who are both repulsive and fascinating. David isn't a mindless psychopath. He's methodical, controlled, and seemingly normal to the outside world, which makes him all the more dangerous. The Silence of the Lambs is a 1988 psychological horror crime novel by Thomas Harris. It follows FBI trainee Clarice Starling, who is assigned to track down a serial killer known as Buffalo Bill with the help of another serial killer and cannibal, Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Buffalo Bill is abducting women in order to skin them and create a suit from human flesh, as he believes he belongs in a woman's body. As Clarice pursues him, Lecter stages a brutal escape by murdering his guards and disguising himself by wearing one of their faces, allowing him to be mistaken for a wounded officer and taken away by paramedics. Clarice eventually locates and kills Buffalo Bill, while Lecter successfully disappears into freedom. The novel presents a chilling mystery with high stakes, as Buffalo Bill keeps his victims in a pit, starving them to loosen their skin before removing it. His disturbing nature is evident in his deep-seated hatred toward women, which is intertwined with his desire to become one. The eerie way Lecter discusses murder and cannibalism adds to the novel's unsettling tone, making it a harrowing psychological thriller. All Quiet on the Western Front is a German novel by Erich Maria Remarque that portrays the experiences of German soldiers during World War I. The disturbing aspects of the book come from its unflinching depiction of the brutal realities of war. Much of World War I was fought in trenches, where soldiers endured starvation, disease, rat infestations, and extreme conditions, often developing gangrene or suffering from flooding in their dugouts. The novel provides deep insight into the psychological toll of killing and the emotional burden placed on young soldiers who were drafted into the war with little understanding of what awaited them. The story also explores the aftermath of war, showing how soldiers who were once celebrated as heroes returned home feeling disillusioned and abandoned by the same society that sent them to fight. The novel has been adapted into 2 films, both of which capture the horrors of war and the lasting trauma it inflicted on those who survived. It by Stephen King is one of the most iconic horror novels ever written, blending supernatural horror with deeply disturbing real-world trauma. At its core, it is about childhood fears, the scars they leave behind, and the cyclical nature of evil. The novel follows the Losers Club, a group of kids in the small town of Derry, Maine, who band together to fight a shape-shifting entity that preys on their worst nightmares, most famously taking the form of Pennywise the Clown. What makes it so unsettling isn't just Pennywise, but how the novel weaves cosmic horror with real-life brutality. The entity feeds on children, not just physically, but by exploiting their most personal fears. However, the horror extends beyond the supernatural. The book is filled with nightmarish portrayals of human evil, from abusive parents and school bullies to domestic violence and racism. Derry itself feels like a cursed town, where people turn a blind eye to suffering, allowing darkness to thrive. One of King's greatest strengths is his ability to write deeply realistic, flawed characters. The Losers Club feels painfully real in their struggles, and their bond is both heartwarming and tragic. The novel is structured in 2 timelines, one in the 1950s when they first face it as children, and another in the 1980s when they are forced to return as adults to finish what they started. The story's use of memory, trauma, and the loss of childhood innocence adds layers of psychological horror beneath the monster hunting. However, it isn't without controversy. The book contains a notoriously uncomfortable scene toward the end of the children's storyline, which has been widely criticized and remains one of the most debated aspects of King's work. While it serves a thematic purpose in the novel's larger message about growing up, many readers find it unnecessary and disturbing in a way that detracts from the story rather than adding to it. The Cthulhu Mythos is one of the most influential horror universes ever created. Lovecraft's works tap into a unique kind of fear, the terror of the unknown and the insignificance of humanity in the face of cosmic entities. Unlike traditional horror, where monsters can be fought or understood, Lovecraftian horror is all about the incomprehensible. The mere sight of beings like Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep is enough to shatter a person's mind, making insanity a recurring theme in his stories. Cthulhu, arguably Lovecraft's most famous creation, is described as an immense, tentacled being that sleeps beneath the Pacific Ocean in the lost city of Royale, waiting for the day when the stars align and it can rise again. However, Cthulhu itself is just one of many eldritch horrors in Lovecraft's universe. The Great Old Ones, outer gods, and other entities exist outside human understanding, making even the knowledge of their existence dangerous. This idea that knowledge itself can be a curse is a hallmark of the mythos. Some of the most well-known stories in the Cthulhu Mythos include The Call of Cthulhu, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and At the Mountains of Madness. Each explores different facets of cosmic horror, whether it's cultists worshipping incomprehensible deities, ancient alien civilizations predating humanity, or the slow unraveling of a protagonist's sanity as they uncover forbidden knowledge. The Bell Jar is the only novel written by American author Sylvia Plath. It is considered semi-autobiographical, following the life of a young woman struggling with mental illness in a society that imposes rigid expectations on women, particularly in the 1960s. One of the most unsettling aspects of the novel is that Plath took her own life just a month after its publication, leading some to speculate that the book was a reflection of her own deteriorating mental state. The story follows Esther Greenwood, a bright undergraduate student from Boston who is awarded an internship at a magazine. Initially excited, she quickly finds the work unfulfilling, which contributes to her growing depression and sense of detachment. While at a country club party, she is introduced to a man named Marco, who attempts to assault her, but she fights back and breaks his nose. After returning home, her mother encourages her to pursue a career considered suitable for women at the time, but Esther rejects this and falls into a deeper depression. She is referred to a psychiatrist and undergoes electroconvulsive therapy, which only worsens her condition. Her mental state deteriorates further, leading to multiple suicide attempts, including swimming far out into the ocean and overdosing on sleeping pills in a cellar. Though she survives, she is institutionalized, where she undergoes further electroconvulsive therapy and continues to struggle with her sense of entrapment as a woman. The novel ends with Esther preparing for a final evaluation to determine whether she can leave the hospital and return to school.